Turn 4. Daytona International Speedway. The last lap of the 1976 Daytona 500. Two cars, side by side, separated by inches, traveling at nearly 180 miles per hour. The car on the outside is the number 43, the most famous car in the history of stock car racing, driven by the king himself, Richard Petty. The car on the inside is the number 21, a red and white Mercury fielded by the Wood brothers, driven by a man they call the Silver Fox, David Pearson. They have been racing each other for more than a decade. They have finished first and second to one another more than 60 times. They know each other's habits, each other's reflexes, each other's tendencies in every conceivable racing situation with an intimacy that exceeds most marriages. And now, on the last lap of the most important race of the year, they are going to settle it one more time. They make contact. Both cars spin. Petty's Dodge slides across the grass and comes to a stop. The engine dead, the car unable to restart. Pearson's Mercury is spinning too, sliding sideways toward the infield. But Pearson does something in the chaos that separates the extraordinary from the merely great. He keeps his foot on the clutch. He keeps the engine running. While the car is still spinning, still sliding, still out of control, Pearson is thinking ahead, planning the next move, calculating how to turn catastrophe into victory. The car comes to rest. Pearson puts it in gear. The engine catches. He limps across the finish line at maybe 20 miles per hour, the car battered, the bumper dragging, smoke trailing behind him. Richard Petty is still sitting in the grass. David Pearson wins the 1976 Daytona 500. Not with speed, not with power, with cunning, with intelligence, with the cold, calculating brilliance of a man who was always thinking one move ahead. 105 career victories in the NASCAR Cup Series, 113 pole positions, 3 Cup Series championships, a winning percentage in races entered that is so staggering, so far beyond what any other driver in the history of the sport has achieved, that it almost defies belief. David Pearson did not race a full Cup Series schedule for much of his career. He picked his races. He chose the biggest events, the most prestigious tracks, the races that mattered most. And then he won them at a rate that no one, not Petty, not Earnhardt, not Gordon, not Johnson, has ever matched. The numbers demand attention. In the races he entered during his partnership with the Wood brothers, Pearson won at a percentage that would be considered dominant in any era of any sport. He did not merely compete. He did not merely contend. He won. With a frequency and a consistency that made the rest of the field, a field that included Richard Petty at the height of his powers, look ordinary by comparison. And yet, David Pearson is not the name that most casual fans associate with the greatest of all time. That distinction, in the popular imagination, belongs to Petty, or to Earnhardt, or to the modern champions whose careers unfolded under the brighter lights of the television era. Pearson, the Silver Fox, the man who may have been the most naturally talented driver ever to sit behind the wheel of a stock car, has been relegated to a tier of recognition that is beneath what his achievements warrant. This is the story of the most underrated champion in the history of NASCAR, a man who came from nothing, who raced with a genius that his competitors acknowledged even as they struggled to overcome it, and who left behind a statistical legacy that, properly understood, may be the most impressive in the sport's history. By the end of tonight, you are going to understand why David Pearson's 105 victories and 3 championships, achieved while racing partial schedules for much of his career, represent the single most efficient body of work in the history of stock car racing. You are going to understand the rivalry with Richard Petty that defined an era. You are going to understand the partnership with the Wood brothers that produced some of the most extraordinary results the sport has ever seen. And you are going to understand why the men who raced against David Pearson, the men who knew his speed and his cunning from the inside of a cockpit rather than the outside of a television screen, considered him the best who ever lived. Before we get started, if you find these stories as moving as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more people who appreciate the legends of the game. Now, let us begin. There are those who measure racing careers by the blunt instrument of the win column, who look at the raw number of victories and conclude that the driver with the most wins is the greatest who ever lived. By that measure, Richard Petty, with 200 victories, stands alone at the summit. But raw victories are a misleading metric because they do not account for the number of races entered, the quality of the competition, or the circumstances under which the victories were achieved. A more sophisticated analysis, one that adjusts for opportunity and evaluates performance on a per-race basis, produces a different picture. And in that picture, the figure at the summit is not the king, it is the silver fox. David Pearson was not flashy. He was not aggressive in the way that Cale Yarborough was aggressive, or intimidating in the way that Dale Earnhardt was intimidating, or charismatic in the way that Richard Petty was charismatic. He was quiet. He was calculating. He was patient in a sport that rewarded patience only when it was accompanied by devastating speed at the moments that mattered. And the patience, combined with the speed, produced a career that was, by any rational analysis, the most efficient in the history of the sport. The efficiency is the key. Pearson did not need 500 races to accumulate his victories. He did not need 1,000 starts to establish his legacy. He did what he did in 674 starts, producing 105 victories, 113 pole positions, and 3 championships while spending most of his prime years running partial schedules. The math is simple. The implications are profound. David Pearson, race for race, was the most successful driver who ever competed in NASCAR, and the story of how a mill worker's son from the upstate of South Carolina achieved that distinction is a story that the sport has never told as fully or as carefully as it deserves. The rivalry with Petty, the partnership with the Wood brothers, the championships won against some of the most talented drivers the sport has ever produced, the 1976 Daytona 500 finish that has been replayed more times than any other moment in the sport's history. Every element of the Pearson story points toward the same conclusion. This was a man who possessed a gift for racing that exceeded the gifts of his contemporaries, and who used that gift with an efficiency and a discipline that have never been matched. The answer to the question of whether David Pearson was the greatest stock car driver who ever lived is not a matter of opinion. It is a matter of evidence, and the evidence, examined carefully and honestly, points in only one direction. The era that produced David Pearson was the era in which stock car racing transformed itself from a regional curiosity into a national sport, and the transformation was neither smooth nor painless. The 1960s and 1970s, the decades that encompassed the prime of Pearson's career, were years of radical change in every dimension of the enterprise, from the tracks on which the races were held to the cars in which they were contested to the economic structures that sustained the competition. The sport that Pearson entered as a young man in the late 1950s was barely recognizable compared to the sport that existed when he retired in the early 1980s, and the distance between the two versions was measured not just in years, but in fundamental shifts of technology, culture, and ambition. The late 1950s, when Pearson began his Cup Series career, were the closing years of the sport's pioneer era. The schedule was a grueling marathon of 50 to 60 races per season, contested on a bewildering variety of surfaces and venues that ranged from half-mile dirt ovals in rural crossroads towns to the high-banked superspeedways that were beginning to reshape the competitive landscape. The dirt track still constituted a significant portion of the schedule, demanding a driving style that was built around sliding the car sideways through the turns, managing wheel spin on a loose surface, and adapting to track conditions that changed from lap to lap as the dirt was worn and compacted and redistributed by the passage of the cars. The transition from dirt to pavement was one of the defining developments of the era. As the sport sought to attract larger audiences and to present a more professional image, the dirt tracks were gradually replaced by paved facilities that offered better spectator amenities, more consistent racing conditions, and speeds that the dirt ovals could not match. The last Cup Series race on a dirt track was held in 1970 at the State Fairgrounds in Raleigh, North Carolina, and its passing marked the end of an era that had shaped the skills and the characters of the drivers who had come of age on the unpaved ovals. Pearson was a product of both worlds. He had learned to race on the dirt tracks of South Carolina, developing the car control and the improvisational instincts that dirt racing demanded. When the schedule shifted to paved tracks, he adapted with a fluidity that demonstrated the depth of his natural talent. The skills he had acquired on dirt, the ability to feel the car at its limits, the willingness to let the rear end slide when the situation demanded it, the instinct for reading the track surface and adjusting his line accordingly, translated directly to the paved tracks, where they gave him an advantage over drivers who had learned their craft exclusively on pavement. The competitive field during Pearson's prime was one of the deepest and most talented in the sport's history. Richard Petty, the king, was accumulating victories at a rate that would eventually produce 200 career wins, a total that seems almost mythological in its magnitude. Bobby Allison was building a career that would produce 84 victories and a championship. Cale Yarborough was developing the ferocious competitive mentality that would carry him to 3 consecutive championships. Junior Johnson, before his transition to team ownership, was still racing with the skill and the audacity that had made him one of the sport's most celebrated figures. Fireball Roberts, before his death in 1964, was the sport's most charismatic and most talented superspeedway racer. Fred Lorenzen, the Golden Boy, was winning races with a consistency that made him one of the most popular drivers of his generation. Against this field, David Pearson competed not just with success, but with a mastery that set him apart from every other driver in the sport. His peers recognized it. The men who raced beside him, who watched him from their mirrors and their peripheral vision, who felt the presence of the number 21 car on their flanks and in their slipstreams, knew that they were racing against someone whose abilities exceeded the normal range of competitive talent. The recognition was not given grudgingly. It was offered with respect and, in some cases, with awe. The economics of the sport during Pearson's era were in transition from the hand-to-mouth finances of the early decades to the more structured, sponsor-driven model that would eventually produce the multi-billion-dollar enterprise that NASCAR is today. The 1960s saw the beginning of the factory involvement that would reshape the competitive landscape, with the major automobile manufacturers, Ford, Chevrolet, Chrysler, investing resources in the sport as a way of promoting their products and demonstrating the performance capabilities of their engines and chassis. The factory money brought better equipment, more sophisticated engineering, and higher levels of competition, raising the bar for every team and every driver in the field. Pearson benefited from the factory era, driving Ford-backed and Mercury-backed cars during some of the most productive years of his career. The factory support provided access to the latest engine technology, the most advanced chassis designs, and the engineering expertise of the manufacturer's racing programs. But the factory support was not permanent, and the periodic withdrawal of manufacturer involvement, driven by corporate budget decisions and the shifting priorities of the automotive industry, created periods of uncertainty that affected every team in the sport. The Wood Brothers Racing Team, which would become Pearson's most important professional home, was itself a product of the era's unique competitive culture. The team was founded by Glenn Wood and his brother Leonard in Stuart, Virginia, and it became one of the most respected and most innovative operations in the sport. The Wood brothers were famous for their pit stop techniques, developing choreographed pit stop procedures that dramatically reduced the time a car spent on pit road. The pit stop innovations that the Wood brothers pioneered became the foundation for the modern pit stop, and their influence on the sport's competitive culture extended far beyond the performance of their own cars. The partnership between Pearson and the Wood brothers, which began in 1972 and lasted for most of the decade, was one of the most productive collaborations in the history of the sport. The team ran a limited schedule, typically entering between 17 and 22 races per season, rather than the full schedule of 28 to 30 races. This approach was driven partly by the team's resources, which were not sufficient to support a full-season campaign, and partly by a strategic calculation that a rested, well-prepared team competing in selected races could produce better results per race than a stretched, exhausted team competing in every event. The limited schedule approach was unconventional, and it was not without its critics. Some observers argued that Pearson's victories and his statistics were inflated by cherry-picking by choosing to compete in races where his chances of winning were highest, and avoiding races where the conditions or the competition might produce less favourable results. The criticism was not entirely fair. Pearson competed in many of the sport's most prestigious and most competitive events, including the Daytona 500, the Coca-Cola 600, the Southern 500 at Darlington, and the other major races that attracted the strongest fields and the most intense competition. His winning percentage in these races was extraordinary, demonstrating that his success was not a function of selective scheduling, but of genuine, overwhelming competitive superiority. The television coverage of the sport during Pearson's era was undergoing a transformation that would eventually change everything about how NASCAR was consumed and understood. In the early 1960s, television coverage of stock car racing was sporadic and often limited to brief highlight packages on regional sports programs. By the mid-1970s, the coverage had expanded significantly, with the major networks broadcasting selected races live and providing the kind of national exposure that the sport needed to grow beyond its southern base. The 1979 Daytona 500, broadcast live by CBS, was the watershed moment, but the expansion of television coverage had been building throughout the decade, gradually increasing the sport's visibility and its commercial appeal. Pearson's career spanned this transformation, and his peak years coincided with the period when the sport's television exposure was growing, but had not yet reached the saturation levels that later eras would achieve. The result was that Pearson's greatest performances were seen by audiences that were larger than those of earlier decades, but smaller than those of later ones, leaving his legacy in a kind of visibility gap that has contributed to his relative underappreciation by modern fans. The safety standards of the era were another defining characteristic that shaped the competitive culture and the personal risks that drivers accepted. The 1960s and 1970s were a period of gradual improvement in racing safety, driven by the accumulation of tragedies that demonstrated the inadequacy of the existing protections. The deaths of Fireball Roberts in 1964, Joe Weatherly in 1964, Billy Wade in 1965, and numerous other drivers created a growing awareness that the sport needed to invest in safety improvements if it was going to continue attracting top-tier talent and maintaining the confidence of its audiences. The improvements came incrementally. Better roll cages, fuel cells designed to reduce the risk of fire in the event of a crash, improved restraint systems, better helmets, fire-resistant driving suits that replaced the cotton uniforms of the earlier era. Each improvement reduced the risk of fatal or serious injury, but the cumulative effect of these improvements, while significant, did not eliminate the fundamental danger of the sport. Drivers continued to be killed and seriously injured throughout Pearson's career, and the acceptance of this danger as an inherent aspect of the profession was a defining feature of the era's competitive culture. Pearson competed within this culture with a characteristic that distinguished him from many of his contemporaries. He was fast, but he was also calculated. He did not take unnecessary risks. He did not engage in the kind of aggressive, contact-heavy racing that some of his rivals embraced as a competitive strategy. His approach was built around intelligence, patience, and the conviction that the smartest driver, rather than the most aggressive one, would ultimately prevail. This approach was not always exciting, and it was not always appreciated by fans who preferred the confrontational style of drivers like Yarborough and Allison, but it was extraordinarily effective, and the 105 victories it produced are the ultimate evidence of its validity. The era in which David Pearson competed was an era of extremes, extreme danger, extreme talent, extreme competitiveness, and extreme change as the sport hurtled from its dirt track origins toward the television-driven, corporate-sponsored future that awaited it. Pearson navigated these extremes with a grace and a mastery that set him apart from every other driver of his generation, producing a body of work that, measured by the efficiency with which it was accumulated, has never been equaled. The cultural landscape of the American South during Pearson's career provided the backdrop against which the sport's transformation unfolded. The South of the 1960s was a region in upheaval, grappling with the civil rights movement, the Vietnam War, and the economic modernization that was reshaping its agricultural and industrial base. Stock car racing, rooted in the white, working-class communities of the region, was both a reflection of and a refuge from these larger forces, providing its fans with a space where the values of toughness, self-reliance, and competitive excellence were celebrated and affirmed. Pearson, the son of a mill worker from the textile community of Whitney, South Carolina, was a product of this cultural environment. His background was humble, his resources were limited, and his path to racing was paved, not with privilege, but with persistence. The fans who supported him recognized in him a kindred spirit, a man who had risen from the same working-class origins that defined their own lives. The connection between Pearson and the fans was authentic, built on a shared understanding of what it means to come from nothing and to make something of yourself through talent and determination. The era shaped Pearson, and Pearson shaped the era. His smooth, calculating driving style, his strategic brilliance, and his extraordinary ability to win races while running a limited schedule established a template for competitive excellence that influenced every driver who followed him. The era was his canvas, and the masterpiece he painted on it, 105 victories and 3 championships, is a work that demands to be appreciated in its full context against the backdrop of the most competitive, most dangerous, and most transformative period in the sport's history. The role of the automobile manufacturers in shaping the competitive dynamics of the era was a defining feature of the 1960s and early 1970s. Ford, Chrysler, and General Motors invested heavily in their NASCAR programs during this period, providing the factory-backed teams with engines, chassis components, and engineering support that gave them significant advantages over the independent operations. The manufacturer involvement raised the overall level of competition, producing faster cars and more sophisticated engineering that pushed the boundaries of what was possible in stock car racing. Pearson benefited directly from the manufacturer involvement, driving Ford-backed and later Mercury-backed cars that were products of the factory racing programs. The factory support provided access to the latest engine technology, the most advanced aerodynamic research, and the engineering expertise of the manufacturer's racing divisions. The engines that powered Pearson's championship cars were the products of factory development programs that invested millions of dollars in the pursuit of competitive advantage, and the resulting power plants were among the most powerful and most reliable in the field. The periodic withdrawal of manufacturer support, driven by corporate budget decisions, energy crises, and the shifting priorities of the automobile industry, created cycles of investment and austerity that affected every team in the sport. The withdrawal of Ford factory support in the late 1970s was a significant event for Pearson and the Wood brothers, who had relied on the manufacturer's backing for much of their competitive success. The team adapted, as it always had, finding ways to remain competitive without the full support of the factory program. But the loss of manufacturer backing was a competitive disadvantage that contributed to the gradual decline in results that characterized the final years of the Pearson-Wood brothers partnership. The engineering culture of the era was characterized by a hands-on, craft-based approach that was fundamentally different from the simulation-driven, data-intensive methodology of modern NASCAR. The cars were built by hand, assembled by mechanics whose understanding of the machine was based on decades of direct experience rather than on computer models and wind tunnel data. The setups were developed through trial and error, refined through test sessions and practice runs that provided the tactile feedback that the drivers and the mechanics needed to optimize the car's performance. Pearson's extraordinary sensitivity to the car's behavior made him an invaluable partner in this development process. He could feel things through the steering wheel that other drivers could not, detecting subtle changes in handling that indicated developing problems or potential improvements. His feedback to the crew was precise and actionable, describing the car's behavior in terms that the mechanics could translate into specific adjustments. The quality of Pearson's feedback was one of the factors that made the Wood brothers' partnership so successful, creating a loop of communication between driver and team that continuously refined the car's performance throughout a race weekend. The television evolution that occurred during Pearson's career had profound implications for the sport's competitive structure and its cultural profile. The growing television audience brought new revenue into the sport, primarily through increased sponsorship dollars from companies that recognized the marketing value of associating their brands with the excitement and the visibility of stock car racing. The increased revenue allowed teams to invest in better equipment, better personnel, and better facilities, raising the overall level of competition and creating a more professional, competitive environment. But the television evolution also changed the nature of the driver's role. As the sport became more visible, the drivers were expected to be not just competitors but entertainers, media figures whose personalities and public images were as important as their on-track performance. This shift favored drivers with charismatic personalities and comfortable media presences, and it disadvantaged drivers like Pearson, whose talents were expressed on the track rather than in front of the camera. The superspeedway racing that developed during Pearson's era was a distinctive form of competition that placed unique demands on the drivers. At Daytona and Talladega, the high-banked superspeedways, where the speeds were highest and the pack racing was most intense, the driver's ability to manage the draft, the aerodynamic phenomenon in which cars running in close formation at high speed create a slipstream that allows them to travel faster than they could alone, was a critical competitive skill. Pearson mastered this skill with characteristic thoroughness, developing an understanding of the draft dynamics that allowed him to position himself advantageously within the pack and to make his moves at the optimal moments. The short track racing that filled the other portion of the schedule demanded a completely different set of skills. At tracks like Bristol, Martinsville, and Richmond, the racing was close, physical, and demanding of patience and car control. The short tracks rewarded the drivers who could manage their tyres over long runs, who could navigate traffic on narrow racing surfaces, and who could maintain their concentration through the repetitive, grinding laps that short track races demanded. Pearson excelled at the short tracks as well as at the superspeedways, demonstrating the versatility that placed him in the highest tier of the sport's all-time competitors. The intermediate tracks, the mile-and-a-half ovals that would eventually come to dominate the Cup Series schedule, presented yet another set of challenges. Charlotte, Atlanta, and Michigan were the marquee intermediate venues during Pearson's era, and the races at these tracks were decided by a combination of car speed, tyre management, pit strategy, and the driver's ability to maintain consistent lap times over long, demanding races. Pearson's performance at the intermediate tracks was consistently strong, reflecting his ability to adapt his driving style and his strategic approach to the specific demands of each venue. The diversity of tracks on the schedule during Pearson's era was itself a distinguishing feature of the competitive landscape. The modern Cup Series schedule is dominated by intermediate ovals, cookie-cutter tracks that share similar configurations and that reward a relatively narrow set of competitive skills. The schedule of Pearson's era was far more diverse, including dirt tracks in the early years, tiny quarter-mile ovals, half-mile short tracks, mile ovals, superspeedways, and road courses. The diversity demanded a breadth of ability that only the most complete drivers could demonstrate, and Pearson's success across the full range of venues was one of the most impressive aspects of his career. The economic realities of the sport during Pearson's era affected the competitive opportunities available to drivers and teams in ways that shaped career trajectories and competitive outcomes. The total revenue generated by the sport was a fraction of what it would eventually become, and the financial margins for most teams were thin. The driver's salary, which in the modern era can reach millions of dollars per year for the sport's top competitors, was modest during Pearson's prime, and many drivers supplemented their racing income with outside employment or relied on the support of family members. The Wood brothers' decision to run a limited schedule was driven, in part, by these economic realities. A full-season campaign required a level of financial investment that the team's resources could not always support, and the selective approach allowed the team to concentrate its resources on the races that offered the best combination of competitive opportunity and financial return. The approach was pragmatic and effective, producing a ratio of investment to results that was among the most efficient in the sport. The era that produced David Pearson was an era of giants: Petty, Allison, Yarborough, Pearson himself, Junior Johnson, who was transitioning from driving to team ownership, the Pettys, the Wood brothers, the independent teams that competed with limited resources and unlimited determination. The era was defined by the quality of its competitors and by the diversity and the danger of the competitive environment in which they operated. To have dominated this era, as Pearson did during his championship years and during the Wood brothers' partnership, was to have demonstrated a level of competitive excellence that places a driver in the very highest tier of the sport's all-time hierarchy. The rule changes that characterized the era were a constant source of competitive disruption and strategic adaptation. NASCAR's governing body frequently modified the technical regulations, adjusting engine specifications, body requirements, aerodynamic allowances, and safety standards in response to competitive imbalances, safety concerns, and the political dynamics of the manufacturer relationships. Each rule change required the teams to adapt their cars and their strategies, creating an environment of perpetual uncertainty that rewarded the teams and the drivers who were most capable of responding to changing conditions. Pearson and the teams he drove for during his career demonstrated an exceptional ability to adapt to rule changes, maintaining their competitive performance through transitions that disrupted the performance of other organizations. The adaptability was rooted in the depth of understanding that Pearson and his engineers possessed, an understanding that went beyond the specific details of any particular set of rules to the fundamental principles of vehicle dynamics and competitive strategy. The Grand National era, which encompassed the first portion of Pearson's career, gave way to the Winston Cup era in 1971, when the R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company assumed primary sponsorship of the Cup Series. The transition brought significant changes to the sport's economic structure, competitive calendar, and public profile, and the drivers who navigated the transition successfully were the ones who were able to adapt not just their racing, but their entire approach to the sport's evolving demands. Pearson navigated this transition with characteristic smoothness. He continued to win races and to compete at the highest level, regardless of the changes in the sport's organizational structure, competitive format, or economic model. The adaptability was a reflection of the fundamental soundness of his competitive approach, which was built not on the exploitation of any particular set of rules or conditions, but on the application of timeless principles of racecraft, tire management, and competitive intelligence that transcended the specific details of any era. The fan culture of the era was another defining characteristic that shaped the competitive environment in which Pearson operated. The fans of the 1960s and 1970s were overwhelmingly Southern, working class, and passionate in their loyalty to particular drivers and teams. The tribal nature of the fan loyalties created an atmosphere at the tracks that was electric, with the supporters of each driver creating distinct sections in the grandstands that were identifiable by the colours and the insignia they displayed. Pearson had his devoted fans, people who appreciated the subtlety and the intelligence of his racing style, and who recognized the depth of his talent even when it was expressed in ways that were less immediately visible than the more aggressive styles of some of his contemporaries. The Pearson fans were in some ways connoisseurs, people who understood the finer points of the sport and who valued the artistry of a perfectly executed race strategy as much as the spectacle of a dramatic wheel-to-wheel battle. The fan base was loyal and enduring, if not always as large or as visible as those of drivers with more outgoing personalities. The role of the crew chief in the era's competitive dynamics was different from the modern understanding of the position. In Pearson's era, The crew chief was often the team's chief mechanic, the person who physically prepared the car and who made the setup decisions that determined its handling characteristics and its competitive potential. The relationship between the driver and the crew chief was intimate and essential, built on trust, communication, and the shared understanding that the car's performance was the product of their combined expertise. Leonard Wood's role in the Pearson story was central. Wood was not just a mechanic. He was an innovator, a problem solver, and a racing mind whose understanding of the car's behavior was as deep and as intuitive as Pearson's own. The partnership between the two men was a dialogue of expertise, with Pearson providing the feedback from the cockpit and Wood translating that feedback into mechanical adjustments that improved the car's performance. The efficiency of this communication loop was one of the primary reasons for the team's extraordinary success. The aerodynamic dimension of racing during Pearson's era was still in its early stages of development. The understanding of how airflow affected the car's speed and handling was rudimentary compared to the sophisticated computational fluid dynamics that modern teams employ, and the aerodynamic adjustments that teams made were often based on intuition and trial and error rather than on scientific analysis. Pearson's feel for the car's aerodynamic behavior, his ability to sense how changes in speed and drafting position affected the car's handling, gave him an advantage in the constantly shifting aerodynamic environment of pack racing at the superspeedways. The schedule compression that characterized the era created a competitive rhythm that was distinctly different from the modern Cup Series calendar. The 50-plus races per season that characterized the early years of Pearson's career were condensed into a period of approximately 10 months, creating a pace of competition that was relentless. Races were held on consecutive weekends, sometimes with midweek events adding to the workload. The physical and mental toll of this schedule was substantial, and the ability to maintain competitive performance through the grinding months of the season was a critical determinant of championship success. Pearson's decision to reduce his schedule must be understood in the context of this grueling competitive rhythm. The full schedule was not merely demanding. It was, for many drivers, destructive, eroding their physical health, their mental sharpness, and their competitive edge over the course of a career that might span 2 or 3 decades. Pearson's partial schedule was, in this light, not a limitation, but a strategy for longevity, a way of preserving the physical and mental resources that championship-level performance demanded. The cultural significance of the 1970s in the history of American motorsport extends beyond the competitive achievements of the drivers who competed during the decade. The 70s were the decade in which stock car racing began to transcend its regional origins and to establish itself as a legitimate national sport. The growth was driven by multiple factors, including the expansion of television coverage, the increasing investment of corporate sponsors, the construction of new tracks in markets outside the traditional southern base, and the emergence of personalities and rivalries that captured the imagination of a broader audience. Pearson was one of the figures who contributed to this growth, though his contribution was expressed more through his competitive achievements than through his public presence. His victories at the sport's most prestigious events provided the competitive substance that the sport needed to justify its claim to national relevance. The Petty-Pearson rivalry provided the narrative drama that audiences demanded, and the excellence of the racing itself, the wheel-to-wheel battles and the strategic duels and the dramatic finishes that the era produced, provided the entertainment value that sustained the sport's growing television audience. The economic model that supported the Wood brothers' partial schedule approach was a distinctive feature of the era's competitive landscape. The team's revenue was derived primarily from race purses and from the sponsor relationships that the team's success had cultivated. The limited schedule meant that the team's total revenue was lower than that of full-time operations, but the team's expenses were correspondingly lower, creating a financial model that was sustainable and that allowed the team to invest its limited resources in the preparation and the performance of the cars it ran. The model was efficient, producing more competitive success per dollar invested than almost any other operation in the sport. The efficiency was a reflection of the team's values, which prioritized quality over quantity and which recognized that the most important measure of competitive success was not the number of races entered, but the number of races won. The Wood brothers' approach was, in many ways, a perfect match for Pearson's own philosophy, and the alignment of their values and their goals was one of the primary reasons for the partnership's extraordinary success. The safety revolution that was beginning to take shape during the later years of Pearson's career would eventually transform the sport into a far safer enterprise than the one he had entered as a young man. The introduction of fuel cells designed to prevent fires, the development of improved roll cage designs that better protected the driver in the event of a crash, the mandating of fire-resistant driving suits and helmets that met higher safety standards. All of these improvements reduced the risk of fatal or serious injury and contributed to the gradual transformation of stock car racing from one of the most dangerous sports in the world to one that, while still inherently risky, offered its participants a significantly higher probability of survival. Pearson competed through this transformation, experiencing firsthand the improvements that each new safety measure brought. He raced in an era when fatal accidents were not uncommon, when the death of a fellow competitor was an event that affected the entire racing community. But that did not halt the competition. The acceptance of risk that characterized the era was not cavalier. It was a calculated acceptance based on the understanding that the sport offered rewards, both financial and personal, that justified the dangers, and that the alternative, a life without racing, was, for the men who competed, a life without meaning. The pit road evolution during Pearson's era was a microcosm of the broader evolution of the sport. In the early years, pit stops were conducted with minimal organization, with crew members performing their tasks in an ad hoc fashion that was slow and often inefficient. The Wood brothers revolutionized the pit stop, introducing choreographed procedures that assigned specific tasks to specific crew members and that minimized the time required for tire changes, fuel stops, and other routine servicing. The innovations that the Wood brothers pioneered during the Pearson years became the standard for the entire sport, influencing the pit stop procedures of every team in the Cup Series field. The impact of these innovations on Pearson's competitive results was significant. The seconds saved on each pit stop translated directly into track position, giving Pearson an advantage that complemented his on-track superiority and that contributed to the team's extraordinary winning percentage. The pit stop advantage was not always the decisive factor in the outcome of a race, but it was a consistent edge that accumulated over the course of a season and over the course of a career made a meaningful contribution to the team's success. The broader competitive landscape of the 1970s, the decade in which the Pearson-Wood brothers partnership produced its most impressive results, was shaped by forces that extended beyond the racetrack. The energy crisis of 1973 and 1974, triggered by the OPEC oil embargo, had a significant impact on the automobile industry and, by extension, on the motorsport industry that depended on it. The crisis led to reduced manufacturer involvement in racing as the automobile companies redirected their resources toward developing more fuel-efficient vehicles in response to the new economic and political realities. The reduction in manufacturer involvement affected the competitive dynamics of the sport, creating opportunities for teams like the Wood brothers, whose independence from the factory programs allowed them to continue competing effectively even when the factory support was withdrawn. The team's ability to maintain its competitive performance through the upheavals of the energy crisis was a testament to the resourcefulness and the self-reliance that characterized its operations, qualities that mirrored the characteristics of its star driver. The competitive calendar of the 70s also saw the emergence of new tracks and new markets that expanded the sport's geographic reach beyond its traditional southern base. The addition of races in the Midwest, the Northeast, and the West Coast reflected the sport's growing national ambitions and created new challenges for the teams and the drivers who had to adapt to unfamiliar tracks and unfamiliar competitive conditions. Pearson's ability to win at tracks across the country, from the traditional southern venues to the newer facilities in the north and the west, demonstrated the universality of his talent and the depth of his competitive preparation. David Gene Pearson was born on December the 22nd, 1934, in Whitney, South Carolina, a mill village nestled in the upstate region of the state, not far from Spartanburg. The community of Whitney was built around the textile mill that employed most of its residents, a company town in the traditional sense, where the houses were owned by the mill, the store was operated by the mill, and the rhythms of daily life were dictated by the shift schedules and the production demands of the cotton processing operation. It was a world of limited horizons and modest expectations, a world where a young man's future was largely predetermined by the accident of his birth. If you were born in Whitney, you worked in the mill. That was the way it was. That was the way it had always been. Pearson's father worked in the mill. The family's circumstances were modest, the kind of genteel poverty that characterized the lives of textile workers across the Carolina Piedmont, people who were neither destitute nor comfortable, but who lived in the narrow space between the two, managing their expenses with a care that left no room for luxuries or extravagances. The young David grew up understanding the value of hard work and the importance of making the most of the limited resources available to him, lessons that would serve him extraordinarily well in a racing career that was defined by efficiency, by the ability to do more with less, by the conviction that intelligence and preparation could compensate for the advantages that money and privilege provided to others. Pearson went to work in the cotton mill himself, following the path that his community had laid out for him. The work was physically demanding, repetitive, and poorly compensated, the kind of labor that occupies the hands while leaving the mind free to dream of something different. Pearson dreamed of racing. The dirt tracks of the upstate South Carolina region, small ovals carved out of the red clay and bordered by wooden fences, were the local entertainment, the places where young men tested their skills and their courage on Saturday nights while the spectators drank beer and cheered from the crude grandstands. Pearson was drawn to these tracks with a fascination that went beyond casual interest. He wanted to race. He wanted it with the quiet, intense desire of a man who has seen, in the smoke and the dust and the roar of the engines, a way out of the life that circumstances have assigned him. He began racing on the local dirt tracks in the mid-1950s, scraping together enough money to buy a used car and to modify it to a level that was minimally competitive. The equipment was inferior. The budget was non-existent. The odds against a mill worker from Whitney making a career in professional racing were overwhelming. But Pearson had something that money could not buy, a natural feel for a race car that was so refined, so intuitive, so seemingly effortless that it defied the understanding of the people who witnessed it. The talent was evident from the very first races. Pearson was not the most aggressive driver on the local circuit. He was not the loudest or the most physically imposing. He was the smoothest. The car moved under his hands with a fluidity that suggested not a man wrestling a machine, but a man conversing with one. He did not fight the car. He listened to it, felt its rhythms, sensed its limits, and guided it through the corners and down the straightaways with a touch so light that the car seemed to be driving itself. The other drivers noticed, the car owners noticed, and the word began to spread through the tight-knit South Carolina racing community that there was a kid from the mill village who could drive like nobody they had ever seen. The transition from local dirt tracks to the NASCAR Grand National Series, the precursor to the modern Cup Series, was gradual. Pearson began running select Cup races in the late 1950s, producing results that were encouraging but not yet sensational. His first full-time Cup season was 1960, when he won the Rookie of the Year award with a performance that confirmed the promise of his early efforts. The rookie season was a foundation, a demonstration that the talent that had been so evident on the local tracks was transferable to the national stage, and that Pearson could compete with the sport's established stars. The championships came quickly. Pearson won his first Cup Series championship in 1966, winning 15 races in a season that was dominated by his exceptional performance. The 15 victories in a single season were a staggering total, a number that reflected not just Pearson's speed, but his consistency, his strategic intelligence, and his ability to manage a championship season with the patience and the discipline that the format demanded. The championship was won with a combination of aggressive racing on the track and methodical point accumulation over the course of the full schedule. The second championship followed in 1968, another dominant campaign that produced 11 victories and confirmed Pearson's status as one of the premier drivers in the sport. The back-to-back near miss in 1967, when he did not win the title, was followed by the triumphant return to championship form in '68, a season in which Pearson demonstrated the sustained excellence that separates champions from mere contenders. The third championship came in 1969, making Pearson a three-time champion, a distinction shared at that time only with Lee Petty, who had won 3 titles in the 1950s. The 3 championships, one in a 4-year span that also included the near-miss of 1967, established Pearson as the dominant force in the sport during the late 1960s. The king, Richard Petty, was accumulating victories at an extraordinary rate, but Pearson was matching him in the championship standings, winning titles and competing for titles with a consistency that made the Petty-Pearson rivalry the central narrative of the era. And then Pearson made a decision that would define the rest of his career, and that would shape the way his legacy was understood for generations to come. He stepped back from full-time competition. The decision was driven by multiple factors. The grueling schedule of the Cup Series, which at that time encompassed close to 50 races per season, was physically and emotionally exhausting. The demands of full-time competition, the constant travel, the repeated stress of racing at the limits of human and mechanical capability, the toll on the body and the mind that 3 championship campaigns had exacted, all of these factors contributed to Pearson's decision to reduce his competitive workload. He was not retiring. He was recalibrating, choosing quality over quantity, selecting the races that mattered most, and approaching them with a preparation and a focus that the full-time schedule did not always allow. The partnership with the Wood Brothers racing team, which began in 1972, was the vehicle through which this recalibrated approach was executed. The Wood Brothers ran a limited schedule, and the alignment between Pearson's desire to race selectively and the team's operational model was a natural fit. The partnership would produce some of the most extraordinary results in the history of the sport, a body of work that, measured by winning percentage, has never been equaled. The Wood Brothers provided Pearson with cars that were consistently competitive, prepared with the meticulous attention to detail that was the hallmark of the team's operations. Leonard Wood, the team's chief mechanic and engineer, was one of the most brilliant technical minds in the sport, a man whose understanding of race car mechanics and whose innovative approach to problem-solving produced cars that were both fast and reliable. The partnership between Pearson's driving genius and Leonard Wood's engineering expertise was a marriage of complementary talents that elevated both men and that produced victories with a frequency that astonished the sport. The numbers from the Wood Brothers' years are almost incomprehensible. Between 1972 and 1979, Pearson won 43 races while entering only 143. That is a winning percentage of more than 30%, a figure so far beyond the normal range of competitive performance that it requires a moment of reflection to fully absorb. Nearly 1 out of every 3 races that David Pearson entered during the Wood Brothers' years resulted in a victory. In a sport where the field includes 30 to 40 competitive cars, where mechanical failure can end a race at any moment, where a single mistake in a 4-hour race can transform a winning car into a losing one, Pearson won nearly a third of the time. And it gets harder to fully grasp the magnitude of this achievement without understanding the quality of the competition he was defeating. Richard Petty was in his prime, winning races and championships with a frequency that would make him the most successful driver in the sport's history. Bobby Allison was building a career that would produce 84 victories. Cale Yarborough was winning 3 consecutive championships with the Junior Johnson team. Darrell Waltrip was emerging as the next great champion. The field was not weak. It was one of the strongest in the sport's history. And Pearson, running a partial schedule with a single car team from Stuart, Virginia, was winning at a rate that none of them could match. The driving style that produced these results was the product of a racing intelligence that was without equal in the sport. Pearson did not drive by instinct alone, though his instincts were extraordinary. He drove with a calculated, deliberate, strategic approach that was as much chess as it was racing. He conserved his car in the early stages of a race, running near but not at the front, preserving his tyres and his engine while the more aggressive drivers wore themselves and their equipment out in the opening laps. As the race progressed and the field thinned and the strategic picture clarified, Pearson would begin to move forward, his car fresh and fast at a point in the race when his competitors' cars were tired and slow. The late race surge was Pearson's signature move, the maneuver that earned him the Silver Fox nickname and that made him the most feared competitor in the closing laps of any race. While other drivers burned their tyres and exhausted their engines in the first half of a race, Pearson was biding his time, waiting, calculating, preparing for the moment when the race would come to him. And when that moment arrived, typically in the final quarter of the race, Pearson would unleash the full capability of his car and his talent, moving through the field with a speed and a precision that left his competitors struggling to respond. The strategy was not without risk. Running further back in the field in the early stages of a race meant that Pearson was more vulnerable to being caught up in accidents involving other cars. It also meant that he sometimes fell too far behind to recover if the race unfolded in a way that did not accommodate his late race charge. But the strategy worked far more often than it failed, and the 105 victories that it produced are the ultimate proof of its effectiveness. But here is what makes this story unforgettable. The strategy was not just a tactical choice, it was an expression of Pearson's fundamental character. He was a patient man, a calculating man, a man who understood that the surest path to victory was not always the most direct one. He did not need to lead every lap. He did not need to make a statement with his qualifying position or his early race speed. He needed to be first when the checkered flag fell, and everything he did during the 4 hours between the green flag and the checkered flag was calibrated toward that single objective. The patience was not passivity. Pearson could be aggressive when the situation demanded it, pushing his car to the absolute limits of its capability in the closing laps when the victory was there to be taken. But the aggression was always controlled, always purposeful, always in service of the larger strategic objective. He did not waste speed the way some drivers waste money, spending it recklessly when it was not needed. He invested it, deploying it at the moments when it would produce the greatest return, and conserving it at the moments when it was not yet required. The rivalry with Richard Petty was the defining competitive relationship of Pearson's career, and one of the greatest rivalries in the history of American sport. The two men finished first and second to each other 63 times during their careers, a frequency of head-to-head competition that is almost unmatched in professional sport. Of those 63 1-2 finishes, Pearson won 33 and Petty won 30. The margin was slim, but it favoured Pearson, a fact that the Silver Fox's admirers have pointed to for decades as evidence that he, rather than Petty, was the superior driver. The rivalry was characterised by a mutual respect that was genuine and deep. Petty and Pearson were not enemies. They were competitors who recognised each other's abilities and who pushed each other to higher levels of performance through the intensity of their competition. They raced hard against each other, sometimes making contact on the track, sometimes engaging in strategic battles that lasted for dozens of laps, and that produced some of the most thrilling racing the sport has ever witnessed. But the competition was always conducted within the bounds of mutual respect, and the relationship between the two men, while shaped by the intensity of their rivalry, was never poisoned by it. The truth gets heavier when you consider what the partial schedule cost Pearson, in terms of the historical recognition that a full-time career might have provided. Pearson's 105 victories, extraordinary as they are, represent the production of a career that was voluntarily limited in scope. Had he run a full schedule throughout his career, had he entered every race on the calendar, rather than the selected events that his arrangement with the Wood brothers allowed, his victory total would almost certainly have been significantly higher. The estimates vary, but the most reasonable projections suggest that Pearson, racing a full schedule with the same winning percentage he maintained on a partial schedule, could have accumulated between 150 and 200 victories, a total that would have placed him alongside or even ahead of Richard Petty on the all-time wins list. This is, of course, a counterfactual, a hypothetical that can never be tested, but it is a counterfactual that deserves consideration, because the failure to account for Pearson's limited schedule when evaluating his career has contributed to the underappreciation that has followed him throughout his life, and that continues to affect his legacy. The raw victory total of 105, while impressive, does not convey the full picture. The winning percentage, the ratio of victories to starts, is the statistic that reveals the true magnitude of Pearson's ability, and that statistic places him in a category that no other driver in the history of the sport has ever occupied. The 1960 championship season, Pearson's first significant foray into full-time Cup Series competition, was the beginning of a journey that would carry him from obscurity to immortality. The Rookie of the Year award he received that season was a formal recognition of a talent that the racing community had been watching with growing interest for several years. Pearson's performances in the late 1950s, in a limited number of Cup starts, had demonstrated the speed and the racecraft that would later carry him to championships. The Rookie of the Year season confirmed that the promise was real, and that Pearson was ready to compete at the highest level of the sport. The years between the Rookie of the Year season and the first championship in 1966 were years of growth and development. Pearson was refining his craft, learning the nuances of Cup Series competition, and developing the strategic approach that would become his signature. He won races during this period, demonstrating his competitiveness, but the sustained, season-long consistency that championship campaigns require was still developing, and the championships were still a few years away. The 1966 championship season was a revelation. 15 victories in a single season was a total that rivaled the best single-season performances in the sport's history. Pearson won at every type of track, on dirt and on pavement, on short tracks and on superspeedways, producing a breadth of victory that reflected the comprehensive nature of his talent. The championship was not won through dominance at any single type of venue. It was won through excellence everywhere, the hallmark of a truly complete driver. The relationship between Pearson and the other members of the championship field during the title years was shaped by the intensity of the competition and by the mutual respect that existed among the sport's best drivers. Pearson was not an aggressive personality off the track. He was quiet, reserved, and content to let his driving do his talking. But on the track, the quiet exterior concealed a competitive intensity that was every bit as fierce as that of his more outwardly aggressive rivals. The difference was that Pearson expressed his intensity through precision and strategy rather than through confrontation and aggression. The decision to step back from full-time competition after the 3 championship seasons was one of the most consequential of Pearson's career. The decision has been debated and analysed by racing historians for decades, with some arguing that it was a strategic masterstroke that allowed Pearson to extend his career and to maintain his competitive edge by avoiding the burnout that a full-time schedule could produce. Others have argued that it was a limitation, a decision that cost Pearson the additional victories and championships that a full-time career might have provided. The truth, as is usually the case, is more nuanced than either interpretation suggests. The decision was driven by a combination of personal, financial, and competitive factors that reflected Pearson's understanding of what he wanted from his career and his life. He wanted to race. He wanted to win. But he also wanted to preserve his health, his sanity, and his relationships with the people he loved. The partial schedule was a compromise, a way of continuing to compete at the highest level while also maintaining a quality of life that a full-time schedule would have made difficult. The Wood Brothers Partnership, which was the vehicle through which the partial schedule approach was implemented, was itself a reflection of Pearson's character and his values. The Wood Brothers were a family team, an operation that valued loyalty, craftsmanship, and the long-term relationships that sustain a racing operation through the ups and downs of competitive life. The alignment between Pearson's values and the Wood Brothers' culture was natural and genuine, and it produced a partnership that was as harmonious off the track as it was successful on it. Glenn Wood, the team's co-founder, recognized in Pearson a driver whose talent and whose character were exactly what the team needed. Leonard Wood, the team's chief mechanic, developed a working relationship with Pearson that was built on mutual respect and effective communication. The crew members who prepared the cars and who performed the pit stops during races understood that they were supporting one of the greatest drivers in the history of the sport, and the pride they took in their work was reflected in the quality of the team's preparation and performance. The specific races that the team chose to enter were typically the most prestigious events on the schedule, the races that attracted the strongest fields and that offered the largest purses. The Daytona 500, the Coca-Cola 600 at Charlotte, the Southern 500 at Darlington, the World 600, the races at Talladega, Atlanta, and the other major venues. The selective approach ensured that Pearson's victories were not accumulated against weak fields, but were won in the toughest competitions the sport offered. The late race strategy that Pearson perfected during the Wood Brothers' years was a competitive approach that required not just intelligence, but also a particular kind of courage. The willingness to run at less than maximum speed during the early and middle stages of a race, while the other drivers were pushing hard and accumulating positions, required the confidence to trust that the strategy would pay off in the closing laps. It also required the discipline to ignore the instinct, to push harder when the car ahead was pulling away, to trust the plan, and to wait for the moment when the plan's advantages would become apparent. The moment when it arrived was always the same. The closing quarter of the race. The tyres on the competing cars are worn. The engines are showing the effects of hours of hard running. The drivers are fatigued, their concentration diminishing with each lap. And David Pearson, whose car is fresh and whose tyres have life remaining, begins to move forward. The progression is not sudden. It is steady, inexorable, like the tide coming in. One position at a time, Pearson works his way toward the front, passing cars that are struggling with the consequences of the hard running they did earlier in the race. By the time the leaders realize what is happening, Pearson is among them, and the car that has been conserved for this moment is faster and more capable than the cars that have been pushed to their limits since the opening lap. The strategy was not infallible. There were races where it did not work, where the pace of the early leaders was too strong, or where the circumstances of the race did not create the conditions that the strategy required. But the strategy worked often enough, and spectacularly enough, to produce a winning percentage that no other driver has ever matched. The 30% winning rate during the Wood Brothers' years was not the product of cherry-picking easy races. It was the product of a strategic approach that was, in the hands of a driver with Pearson's talent and intelligence, devastatingly effective. The physical demands of racing during Pearson's era were substantial, and the toll they exacted on the drivers' bodies was significant. The heat, the vibration, the G-forces, the constant physical effort of wrestling a heavy car through corners and down straightaways, all of these factors accumulated over the course of a career and left their mark. Pearson's approach to these demands was characteristically intelligent. By running a partial schedule, he reduced the total physical load on his body, allowing himself more time for recovery between races and preserving his physical capabilities for the races that mattered most. The approach was ahead of its time. Modern sports science recognizes the importance of recovery and load management in optimizing athletic performance, and the partial schedule approach that Pearson pioneered anticipates the principles that are now standard in professional sport. Pearson did not have the benefit of modern sports science when he made his decision. He relied on his own understanding of his body and his own assessment of what he needed to sustain championship-caliber performance. The instinct was sound, and the results validated it. The Whitney Mill village that shaped David Pearson's character deserves additional examination because its influence on the man and the driver was so pervasive and so enduring. Whitney was not just the place where Pearson grew up. It was the place that taught him the values that defined his career and his life, the humility that came from working-class origins, the patience that came from watching crops grow and textiles spin, the quiet confidence that came from knowing your worth without needing to announce it, the discipline that came from a life organized around the clock and the shift schedule. These values were not the values of the racetrack, at least not the racetrack as it was popularly understood. The racetrack valued aggression, spectacle, and the kind of loud, visible dominance that made for exciting television and enthusiastic crowds. Pearson brought a different set of values to the racetrack, the values of Whitney, and the fact that these values produced 105 victories and 3 championships is a demonstration that there is more than one way to win, that the quiet approach can be as effective as the loud one, and that the man who knows his craft and practices it with disciplined excellence does not need to advertise his competence. The early hardships that Pearson endured on his way to professional racing included not just the financial limitations that affected every driver from a working-class background, but also the physical demands of a lifestyle that combined mill work with racing. The shifts at the cotton mill were long and physically taxing, and the hours spent working in the mill were hours that could not be spent on the race car or on the track. The double life of mill worker and aspiring racer required an energy and a determination that went beyond what most people possess, and Pearson's ability to sustain both pursuits simultaneously was an early indication of the discipline and the work ethic that would later carry him to championships. The moment when Pearson decided to leave the mill and pursue racing full-time was a watershed in his personal history. The decision was not taken lightly. Walking away from a steady paycheck, however modest, in pursuit of a career in professional racing was a gamble that offered no guarantees and that carried the risk of financial ruin if the talent that Pearson believed he possessed proved insufficient at the national level. The decision required courage, not the physical courage of driving at high speed, but the quieter, more fundamental courage of betting on yourself and accepting the consequences of the bet. The bet paid off. Pearson's talent, which had been evident on the local tracks, proved to be more than sufficient at the national level. The victories came, slowly at first and then with increasing frequency, and the career that had seemed like such a risky gamble began to reveal itself as one of the most successful in the history of the sport. The intellectual approach that Pearson brought to racing was unusual for the era and was one of the factors that contributed to his extraordinary success. While many of his contemporaries relied primarily on natural talent and physical courage, Pearson supplemented these qualities with a systematic, analytical approach to the competitive challenge. He studied the tracks, learning the specific characteristics of each venue and developing strategies that were tailored to the unique demands of each race. He studied his competitors, observing their tendencies and identifying the patterns in their driving that could be exploited. And he studied his own car, developing an understanding of the machine's behavior that allowed him to communicate with his crew with a precision that enhanced the team's ability to optimize the car's performance. The analytical approach was not cold or mechanical. Pearson's racing was animated by the same passion and the same competitive fire that motivated every other driver in the field. But the fire was controlled, directed, channeled through the filter of intelligence into a form of competition that was simultaneously passionate and calculated. The combination was unique, and the results it produced were unmatched. The relationship between Pearson and his family during the racing years was shaped by the same values that characterized his public life. He was a devoted husband and father, committed to the well-being of his family, and to the maintenance of the relationships that sustained him through the demands of professional competition. The family provided the emotional anchor that allowed Pearson to pursue his career with the focus and the intensity that championship-level competition demanded, and the stability of his personal life was a contributing factor to the consistency of his professional performance. Helen Pearson, David's wife, was the steady presence at home who managed the household and the family while her husband was on the road, competing at tracks across the country. The partnership between David and Helen was a foundation upon which the entire career was built, and the contributions she made to the family's stability and well-being were essential to the success that David achieved on the track. The competitive intelligence that Pearson demonstrated throughout his career was not limited to his in-car strategy. It extended to his approach to every aspect of the racing enterprise, from the preparation of the car to the management of his relationships with his team, his sponsors, and his competitors. Pearson understood that racing was not just a physical contest. It was a complex, multi-dimensional challenge that required excellence in every dimension, from the mechanical preparation of the car to the strategic management of the race, to the psychological dynamics of competing against men who were both colleagues and adversaries. The psychological dimension of Pearson's competitive approach was particularly sophisticated. He understood the impact that his reputation for late race speed had on his competitors, and he used that understanding to his advantage. The knowledge that David Pearson was lurking behind them, waiting to make his move, created a psychological pressure on the leaders that affected their decision-making and their driving. They pushed harder than they might have otherwise, wearing their tires and their engines in an effort to build a lead that Pearson could not overcome. The extra effort often backfired, creating the very conditions that Pearson's strategy was designed to exploit. The mind game was subtle and effective, and it was one of the dimensions of Pearson's competitive intelligence that set him apart from drivers who relied more heavily on physical ability and less on psychological strategy. Pearson was not a trash talker. He did not engage in the public psychological warfare that some of his contemporaries employed. His psychological advantage was expressed entirely through his on-track performance, through the consistent demonstration of late race speed that created an expectation in the minds of his competitors that they would have to deal with him in the closing laps, regardless of how far behind he might appear to be at the midpoint of the race. The dirt track skills that Pearson had developed in the early years of his career continued to serve him throughout his professional life. The ability to feel the car at its limits, to sense when the tires were beginning to lose grip, to adjust the car's attitude through subtle inputs of steering and throttle, these were skills that had been honed on the loose, unpredictable surfaces of the South Carolina dirt ovals, and that translated directly to the challenges of paved track racing. The drivers who had learnt their craft exclusively on pavement often lacked this sensitivity, and the advantage it gave Pearson was real and significant. The family life that sustained Pearson through the demands of his racing career was characterized by a stability and a groundedness that reflected the values of his upbringing. The Pearson household was not the household of a celebrity. It was the household of a working man who happened to be extraordinarily good at his job. The values that governed the household, hard work, modesty, loyalty, and the quiet enjoyment of the simple pleasures of family life, were the values of Whitney, carried forward into a life that was, in its public dimensions, far more extraordinary than anything the Mill Village could have produced. The sons who grew up in the Pearson household, Ricky and Larry and Eddie, all pursued racing careers of their own, carrying the Pearson name into the next generation of stock car competition. Ricky Pearson competed in the Cup Series, following his father's path to the highest level of the sport. The continuation of the family tradition was a source of pride for David, who saw in his sons' careers a validation of the values and the skills that had defined his own. The legacy of the 3 championships that Pearson won in the late 1960s is a legacy that connects the old era of the sport to the new. The championships were won during a transitional period when the sport was evolving from the dirt track small-town enterprise of its origins to the paved track, nationally televised spectacle that it would eventually become. Pearson's ability to win championships during this transitional period, adapting to the changing competitive conditions while maintaining the standards of excellence that the title demanded, was a demonstration of the versatility and the intelligence that were the hallmarks of his career. The contrast between Pearson's public modesty and his on-track dominance was one of the most compelling paradoxes of his career. In the garage area, he was the quietest of the elite drivers, the one least likely to hold court for the media or to engage in the public posturing that some of his competitors employed. He did not boast about his victories. He did not disparage his rivals. He did not seek the attention that his achievements warranted. The modesty was genuine, not a strategy or an affectation, but an expression of the character that Whitney had formed. On the track, the modesty vanished. Pearson drove with a confidence and a decisiveness that was as absolute as any driver in the field. He made his moves with precision, passing competitors at moments and in places that demonstrated his complete mastery of the competitive situation. The contrast between the quiet man in the garage and the commanding presence in the cockpit was striking, and it revealed a depth of character that simple assessments of personality could not capture. Pearson was not shy. He was selective, choosing to express his competitive nature through his driving rather than through his words. The financial trajectory of Pearson's career reflected the broader economic evolution of the sport. In the early years, the prize money was modest, and the financial rewards of even a successful racing career were far from guaranteed. As the sport grew and the sponsorship revenues increased, the financial rewards improved. But Pearson, racing a partial schedule for much of his prime, never achieved the earnings that a full-time schedule might have provided. The financial sacrifice was a component of the broader trade-off that Pearson made when he chose quality over quantity, and it was a sacrifice that reflected his priorities and his values. The equipment that Pearson drove during his championship years was competitive, but not always dominant. Unlike some modern champions who benefit from the technological superiority of their team's equipment, Pearson often won with cars that were good but not the best in the field. His ability to extract maximum performance from the available equipment, to overcome the limitations of the car through the application of skill and intelligence, was one of the factors that set him apart from drivers who were more dependent on having the fastest car. The 3 consecutive top-tier seasons of 1966 through 1969, which produced 3 championships and 1 near miss, represented the peak of Pearson's full-time competitive career. The 4 seasons were a demonstration of sustained excellence that placed Pearson alongside the greatest championship performers in the sport's history. The 15 victories in 66, the championship-caliber performance in 67, the 11-win championship in 68, and the championship-winning season in 69 constituted a run of dominance that has few parallels in the sport's history. The decision to step back after this extraordinary run was, in retrospect, a pivotal moment not just in Pearson's career, but in the sport's historical narrative. Had Pearson continued to run a full schedule throughout the 1970s, competing in every race against Petty, Allison, and Yarborough, the competitive landscape of the era would have been dramatically different. The championships that were won by other drivers during the 70s might have been won by Pearson instead, and the historical narrative of the era might have centered on Pearson's dominance rather than on the rivalries and the alternating fortunes that actually characterized the decade. But Pearson made his choice, and the choice produced a different kind of legacy, one built not on the accumulation of championships and victories through a full-time schedule, but on the astonishing efficiency of a partial schedule approach that produced victories at a rate that no full-time competitor could match. The legacy is different from what it might have been, but it is no less impressive, and it is, in its own way, more remarkable because the ability to win at a 30% rate in selective starts requires a level of consistency and competitive excellence that exceeds what even the best full-time schedule demands. The Wood Brothers team facility in Stewart, Virginia, was a modest operation by modern standards, a family compound that served as workshop, office, and gathering place for the small team of craftsmen who built and maintained the racing cars. The facility reflected the team's values, functional rather than ostentatious, organized for efficiency rather than for display. The cars that emerged from the Stewart workshop were built with a care and a precision that reflected the pride of the people who assembled them. Every component inspected, every system tested, every detail attended to with the thoroughness that winning requires. The atmosphere in the Wood Brothers shop during the Pearson years was one of quiet professionalism. The team members understood their roles and performed them with the competence that comes from years of experience and the dedication that comes from genuine investment in the team's success. There was no drama, no chaos, no last-minute scrambles to prepare the car for competition. The preparation was systematic and thorough, a reflection of the values that Glenn and Leonard Wood had instilled in their organization, and that Pearson's own approach to racing perfectly complemented. The integration of Pearson into the Wood Brothers operation was seamless because the driver and the team shared the same philosophy: excellence through preparation, victory through intelligence, success through the disciplined application of talent and knowledge. The alignment of values created a partnership that was, for the better part of a decade, the most efficient competitive operation in the history of the sport, producing victories at a rate that astonished the competition and that has never been duplicated. The contributions of Eddie Wood and Len Wood, the second generation of the Wood family, who were increasingly involved in the team's operations during the Pearson years, added depth to the organization and ensured the continuity of the team's culture and its competitive standards. The multi-generational nature of the Wood Brothers operation mirrored the multi-generational dynasties that characterized the sport more broadly, and the family's continued involvement in NASCAR through the decades that followed the Pearson partnership is a testament to the durability of the values and the traditions that the team was built upon. The 1976 Daytona 500 finish, which opened this narrative, was the single most iconic moment of David Pearson's career and one of the most famous finishes in the history of motorsport. The race had been a battle between Pearson and Petty throughout, the two rivals trading the lead multiple times and engaging in the kind of strategic duel that had become their signature. Pearson, running the Wood Brothers Mercury, had employed his characteristic patience during the early and middle stages of the race, running near the front but conserving his car for the closing laps when the race would be decided. As the final laps unfolded, the race came down to what everyone in the grandstands had expected: Pearson and Petty, side by side, fighting for the victory on the world's most famous racetrack. Pearson made his move on the last lap, pulling alongside Petty in turn 3 and attempting to pass on the outside. The two cars ran side by side through the turn, neither driver willing to yield, both men pushing their machines to the absolute limits of adhesion and speed. As they exited turn 4 and headed toward the finish line, the cars made contact. The contact sent both vehicles spinning, sliding across the track surface in a cloud of smoke and rubber. Petty's car slid into the infield grass and stalled, the engine dying as the car came to rest. Pearson's car was also spinning, sliding sideways toward the infield, but in the chaos of the spin, Pearson did something that revealed the depth of his racing intelligence. He kept his left foot on the clutch, preventing the engine from stalling, even as the car was rotating and sliding, and completely out of control. The presence of mind required to perform this maneuver in the heat of a last-lap crash at Daytona, while the car is spinning at high speed and the outcome of the race is hanging in the balance, is almost impossible to comprehend. It was not a reflex. It was a calculated decision, made in a fraction of a second, by a mind that was thinking not about the crash, but about what would happen after the crash. The car came to rest. Pearson engaged the gear. The engine, which had never stopped running, propelled the battered Mercury forward, and Pearson limped across the finish line at a crawl, the car smoking, the bodywork damaged, the bumper dragging on the ground. Behind him, in the infield grass, Richard Petty was frantically trying to restart his engine, but the car would not fire. Pearson crossed the line first. The victory was his. Won, not with speed, but with intelligence. Not with aggression, but with cunning. Not with the roar of a healthy engine, but with the cough and sputter of a battered one. The images from that day, the two wrecked cars, one limping across the finish line and the other sitting helpless in the grass, have become some of the most iconic in the sport's history. They captured, in a single frame, the essence of the Petty-Pearson rivalry and the essence of David Pearson's competitive genius. In the moment of crisis, when both drivers were in the same dire situation, Pearson's superior racing intelligence, his ability to think ahead even in the chaos of a crash, was the difference between victory and defeat. The Darlington Raceway mastery was another defining element of Pearson's career portfolio. Darlington, the egg-shaped oval in the PD region of South Carolina, was the track that was closest to Pearson's home and the track where his talents were most fully expressed. The Lady in Black, as Darlington was known, was one of the most demanding and most unforgiving tracks on the circuit. Its asymmetric layout, with one end tighter than the other, required constant adjustment and absolute precision from the drivers. Its abrasive surface consumed tyres with a ferocity that could transform a competitive car into a struggling one in a handful of laps. Its narrow racing surface and close walls punished mistakes with the kind of immediate, violent feedback that separated the great from the merely good. Pearson won at Darlington more than any other driver in the track's history, accumulating victories at the South Carolina track with a regularity that reflected his mastery of its unique challenges. The Darlington victories were not won through brute force or through the superiority of his equipment. They were won through the precise application of the skills that made Pearson the most complete driver of his era: tyre management, car conservation, patience in the early laps, and devastating speed in the closing stages when the race was there to be won. The numbers are striking when you examine Pearson's record at Darlington in detail. He won the Southern 500, the track's marquee event, multiple times, and his overall winning percentage at the track was among the highest that any driver has ever achieved at a single venue. The track seemed to respond to his particular combination of skills, rewarding the smoothness and the precision that were the hallmarks of his driving style, while punishing the aggression and the impatience that characterized some of his rivals. The 1966 championship season was the first of Pearson's 3 title campaigns and the one that announced his arrival as a championship-caliber driver. The 15 victories he produced that season were a staggering total, reflecting a dominance that few drivers in any era have matched. The victories came at every type of track on the schedule, from the superspeedways to the short tracks to the intermediate ovals, demonstrating the breadth of Pearson's ability and the depth of his competitive preparation. The championship was won with a combination of speed and consistency that reflected Pearson's mature understanding of what championship racing requires. He did not need to win every race. He needed to accumulate points, to minimize the bad days and maximize the good ones, to manage the championship as a season-long campaign rather than a series of individual events. The discipline required to maintain this approach over a season of nearly 50 races was extraordinary, and Pearson's ability to sustain it was a testament to the mental strength that was one of his defining characteristics. The 1968 championship was won with a similar combination of speed and consistency, 11 victories providing the backbone of a points total that was sufficient to claim the title. The season was contested against a field that included Petty, who was in the midst of his own dominant run, and the battle between the two men for the championship was one of the highlights of the season. Pearson prevailed, outpointing Petty in the final standings and claiming his second championship in 3 years. The 1969 championship completed the trilogy, making Pearson a 3-time champion and confirming his status as one of the greatest drivers in the sport's history. The season was another demonstration of sustained excellence, with victories distributed across the full range of tracks on the schedule. The championship was won against a field that was growing more competitive with each passing season, as younger drivers emerged and established stars continued to perform at high levels. The Wood brothers' years produced a string of victories that included some of the most memorable performances of Pearson's career. The superspeedway victories at Daytona and Talladega demonstrated his mastery of restrictor plate racing, the ability to manage the draft, to position himself within the pack, and to make the critical move at the critical moment. The victories at Charlotte and Atlanta demonstrated his skill on the intermediate ovals that constituted the backbone of the Cup Series schedule, and the victories at Darlington and other tracks demonstrated the versatility that made him competitive everywhere the series raced. The partnership with the Wood brothers also produced some of the most significant technological innovations in the sport's history. The pit stop procedures that the team developed, involving choreographed movements and specialized tools that reduced the time required for tire changes and fuel stops, became the model for every pit crew in the sport. The innovations were driven by the recognition that a few seconds saved on pit road could translate into a significant competitive advantage on the track, and the Wood brothers' willingness to invest time and effort in optimizing their pit stop performance gave Pearson an advantage that complemented his on-track superiority. The 113 career pole positions that Pearson accumulated were another measure of his extraordinary ability. The pole position, awarded to the driver who posts the fastest time in qualifying, is a measure of outright speed, the ability to extract the maximum performance from the car over a single lap. Pearson's pole position total was the highest in the sport's history at the time of his retirement, and it demonstrated that the Silver Fox was not merely a strategic genius who won races through conservation and patience. He was also one of the fastest drivers who ever lived, capable of producing single-lap speeds that were the equal of or superior to anyone in the field. The pole positions were significant because they challenged the narrative that Pearson was primarily a conservative, defensive driver who won through strategy rather than speed. The truth was more nuanced. Pearson possessed both qualities, the raw speed that earned pole positions and the strategic intelligence that turned those pole positions into victories. He could be the fastest car on the track in qualifying and the smartest driver in the field during the race, and the combination of these two qualities was what made him so extraordinarily difficult to beat. The 1974 season was one of the most remarkable of the Wood brothers' years. Pearson won 11 races in only 19 starts, a winning percentage of nearly 58% that is almost certainly the highest single-season winning percentage in the history of the sport for a driver with a significant number of starts. The 11 victories included wins at Daytona, Charlotte, Darlington, and other major venues, demonstrating that the dominant performance was not limited to a single type of track, but extended across the full range of the schedule. The consistency that accompanied the victories was equally impressive. In the races he did not win, Pearson typically finished near the front, contributing to a season average finish that reflected the sustained excellence of the team's performance. The 1974 season was, by any reasonable measure, the finest single season of Pearson's career and one of the finest single seasons in the history of the sport. The final years of Pearson's career were marked by a gradual decline in the frequency of victories and the consistency of top-level performance. The partnership with the Wood brothers ended in 1979, and Pearson competed for other teams in the early 1980s without reproducing the results that the Wood brothers' years had produced. The decline was gradual rather than sudden, reflecting the natural aging process and the increasing competitiveness of a field that was being supplemented by talented younger drivers. The relationship between Pearson and the other members of the elite group of drivers who defined the era's competitive landscape was characterized by a mutual recognition of each other's abilities that transcended the rivalries and the competitive tensions. Pearson, Petty, Allison, and Yarborough competed against each other with an intensity that was genuine and unrelenting, but they also respected each other with a depth that reflected the understanding that they were all engaged in the same extraordinarily demanding and extraordinarily dangerous pursuit. The respect was earned on the track, in the heat of competition, and it endured long after the racing careers had ended. The quiet nature of Pearson's personality contributed to the underappreciation of his career. He was not a showman, he was not a self-promoter, He did not court media attention or cultivate the kind of public persona that generates the name recognition and the cultural visibility that translate into historical reputation. He let his driving speak for itself, and the driving spoke eloquently. But in a media-driven culture, where visibility and name recognition are powerful determinants of historical reputation, Pearson's reticence worked against him, allowing his achievements to be overshadowed by the more publicly visible careers of his contemporaries. Petty was the king, the most recognizable figure in the sport, a man whose cowboy hat and sunglasses and easy southern charm made him the perfect ambassador for a sport that was seeking national acceptance. Petty's public visibility, combined with his extraordinary victory total, ensured that he would be the driver most closely associated with the era in the public memory. Pearson, by contrast, was private, reserved and uncomfortable in the public eye. His genius was expressed on the track rather than in front of the cameras, and the result was that his achievements, while recognized within the racing community, were less well known to the broader public than those of his more visible rival. The distinction between Pearson's reputation within the racing community and his reputation in the broader culture is one of the most interesting aspects of his legacy. Within the community, among the drivers and the crew chiefs and the team owners and the journalists who covered the sport on a daily basis, Pearson was widely regarded as the most talented driver of his era and one of the most talented drivers in the history of the sport. The respect he commanded from his peers was unanimous and unqualified. But outside the community, in the broader world of American sport and American culture, Pearson's name carried less weight than those of Petty, Earnhardt, and the other drivers who had cultivated more visible public personas. The Hall of Fame induction in 2011, as part of the inaugural class that also included Richard Petty, Dale Earnhardt, Junior Johnson, and Bill France Sr., was a belated but important recognition of Pearson's place among the sport's all-time greats. The inclusion in the inaugural class was significant, an acknowledgement that Pearson's contributions to the sport were on the same level as those of the most celebrated figures in its history. The induction ceremony was an emotional occasion, a moment when the sport formally honored a man whose achievements had been recognized by his peers for decades, but whose place in the public consciousness had not always reflected the magnitude of what he had accomplished. But here is what makes this story unforgettable. Pearson did not change after the induction. He did not suddenly become more visible, or more vocal, or more actively engaged in the promotion of his own legacy. He remained the same private, reserved, quietly confident man he had always been, content to let the record speak for itself, and trusting that the people who understood the sport would understand the significance of what he had achieved. The consistency of his character, the unwavering commitment to the values of modesty and hard work that had defined his entire life, was itself a kind of victory, a demonstration that greatness does not require self-promotion, and that the most impressive achievements are sometimes the ones that speak the quietest. The pole position battles between Pearson and Petty were a recurring subplot of their rivalry. Qualifying in the Cup Series is a test of outright speed, the ability to extract the maximum performance from the car over a single lap, and the pole position battles between the two rivals were consistently among the most closely contested qualifying sessions on the schedule. Pearson's 113 career poles testified to his extraordinary qualifying speed, a speed that challenged the narrative of him as primarily a conservative, strategic driver, and that demonstrated the raw talent that underpinned his racing intelligence. The qualifying sessions at the superspeedways were particularly notable. At Daytona and Talladega, where the speeds were highest and the margins between qualifying positions were smallest, Pearson consistently produced laps that were among the fastest in the field. His ability to drive a qualifying lap at the absolute limit of the car's capabilities, extracting every fraction of a second from the engine and the aerodynamics, was a skill that complemented his race day patience and that gave the Wood Brothers team the strategic advantage of starting near the front of the field. The strategic advantage of a strong qualifying position was significant. Starting at or near the front of the field reduced the risk of being caught in the first lap incidents that frequently occurred in the middle and rear of the pack. It also gave Pearson a clear view of the track ahead, reducing the need to navigate through traffic and allowing him to establish his race day rhythm without the complications that a poor starting position could create. The qualifying excellence was not just a statistical achievement, it was a tactical tool that enhanced the effectiveness of the late race strategy that was the foundation of Pearson's competitive approach. The Charlotte Motor Speedway races were among the marquee events of Pearson's career, and his performances at the mile-and-a-half oval in Concord, North Carolina, were consistently among the best in the field. Charlotte was the capital of the NASCAR world, the track where the sport's biggest events were held, and where the competition was always at its most intense. Pearson's victories at Charlotte, accumulated over the course of a career that spanned multiple decades, demonstrated his ability to perform on the sport's grandest stages. The relationship between Pearson and the Wood brothers' crew chief, Leonard Wood, was one of the most productive technical partnerships in the history of the sport. Leonard's understanding of race car mechanics was encyclopedic, and his ability to prepare a car that suited Pearson's driving style was a critical factor in the team's success. The communication between the two men was efficient and effective, built on years of shared experience and mutual trust. Pearson would describe the car's behavior, Leonard would diagnose the issue, the adjustments would be made, and the car would go faster. The pit stop innovations that the Wood brothers pioneered during the Pearson years were a significant competitive advantage. The team's pit stops were faster and more efficient than those of their competitors, thanks to the choreographed procedures and the specialized tools that Leonard Wood had developed. The seconds saved on pit road translated directly into track position, giving Pearson an advantage that complemented his on-track superiority and that contributed to the team's extraordinary winning percentage. The restrictor plate era, which began in 1988 with the mandating of restrictor plates at Daytona and Talladega, occurred after the peak of Pearson's career, but was foreshadowed by the aerodynamic and speed-related challenges that the superspeedway races presented during his prime. The extreme speeds that the cars reached at Daytona and Talladega during the 1970s, speeds that sometimes exceeded 200 miles per hour, created safety concerns that would eventually lead to the restrictor plate mandate. Pearson raced at these speeds without the safety nets that modern drivers enjoy, demonstrating a physical courage that complemented his racing intelligence. The versatility of Pearson's winning record is one of the most impressive statistical features of his career. He won on superspeedways, on short tracks, on intermediate ovals, and on road courses, producing victories at virtually every type of venue on the Cup Series schedule. The breadth of the winning record demonstrated that Pearson's success was not a function of specialization, of dominating one type of track while struggling at others. It was a function of comprehensive excellence, of the ability to adapt his driving style and his competitive approach to the specific demands of each venue. The races at Darlington hold particular significance in the Pearson legacy, not just because of the number of victories he accumulated there, but because of the nature of the track and what success there required. Darlington was the track that most demanded the qualities that Pearson possessed in abundance, smoothness, precision, patience, and the ability to maintain concentration over the course of a grueling race. The track rewarded the driver who could run close to the wall without hitting it, who could manage his tires over long runs without sacrificing speed, and who could maintain his composure as the race wore on and the track surface became increasingly challenging. Pearson's Darlington victories were masterclasses in the art of stock car racing, demonstrations of the skills and the strategies that made him the most efficient competitor the sport has ever seen. Each victory was a lesson in how to win a stock car race, not through overwhelming speed or aggressive intimidation, but through the patient, calculated application of skill and intelligence. The later career challenges that Pearson faced, including the separation from the Wood brothers in 1979, and the declining results that characterized his final years of competition, are a necessary part of the complete story. The separation from the Wood brothers was reportedly precipitated by an incident at Darlington, in which a miscommunication during a pit stop led to Pearson leaving pit road with the car not fully prepared. The incident, and the tensions it revealed, ended a partnership that had been one of the most productive in the sport's history. After leaving the Wood brothers, Pearson competed for several other teams, producing occasional victories, but never recapturing the sustained excellence that had characterized the Wood brothers' years. The decline was gradual, reflecting the natural aging process and the difficulty of finding a team whose capabilities matched those of the Wood brothers' operation. Pearson's final Cup Series victory came in 1980, and he retired from full-time competition shortly thereafter. The retirement was quiet, consistent with the character of a man who had never sought the spotlight. There was no farewell tour, no series of ceremonial last appearances at tracks across the country. Pearson simply stopped racing, transitioning from the cockpit to private life with the same lack of fanfare that had characterized his entire public career. The absence of a dramatic exit contributed to the gradual fading of Pearson's visibility in the public consciousness as the sport moved on to new champions and new narratives that captured the attention of the media and the fans. The impact of the 1974 season deserves re-emphasis because it represents, in a single year, the fullest expression of Pearson's abilities. 11 victories in 19 starts, a winning percentage of nearly 58%. Victories at Daytona, Charlotte, Darlington, Atlanta, Dover and Rockingham, among other tracks. The season was a demonstration of competitive dominance that has rarely been matched in the history of the sport, and it provided the statistical evidence that supports the case for Pearson as the most efficient driver who ever lived. The season also demonstrated the effectiveness of the partnership between Pearson and the Wood brothers at its peak. The cars were fast and reliable, the pit stops were efficient, the strategic approach was executed with precision, and Pearson, behind the wheel, was operating at a level that none of his contemporaries could consistently match. The 1974 seasons was the Pearson-Wood brothers partnership at its zenith, a collaboration of driver talent and team competence that produced results that were as close to perfection as the sport has ever seen. The head-to-head record between Pearson and Petty is one of the most analysed statistical relationships in the history of the sport, and the details of that record provide illuminating insights into the nature of their rivalry. 63 races in which they finished first and second, 33 victories for Pearson, 30 for Petty. The margin of 3 wins in Pearson's favour is slim, but it is consistent, and it is statistically meaningful, suggesting that in the most direct form of competition, the head-to-head battle for the victory, Pearson held a slight but real advantage over his great rival. The races in which Petty prevailed were, in many cases, races in which the King's car was simply faster, where the combination of Petty's driving ability and his team's preparation produced a speed advantage that Pearson's intelligence and strategy could not overcome. The races in which Pearson prevailed were often races in which his superior strategy, his better tyre management, or his more effective late-race execution gave him the edge over a rival whose car might have been the faster of the two. The dynamic between the two men was, in essence, a contest between different forms of competitive excellence, with Petty's consistency and speed competing against Pearson's intelligence and efficiency. The racing community's assessment of this rivalry has consistently favoured Pearson, not because the community was biased against Petty, but because the community understood, from direct observation, the depth of the competitive advantage that Pearson's intelligence provided. The men who raced against both drivers, who saw their abilities from the cockpit rather than the grandstands, were almost universally of the opinion that Pearson was the more complete and the more difficult competitor. The opinion was not always expressed publicly, because Petty was the sport's most beloved figure, and because criticising the King was not a popular or a comfortable position. But in the private conversations of the garage area, the verdict was clear. The Daytona mastery that Pearson demonstrated throughout his career extended beyond the famous 1976 finish. He won at Daytona multiple times, producing victories at the sport's most important track with a consistency that reflected his mastery of superspeedway racing. The combination of his qualifying speed, which consistently placed him near the front of the field, and his race day strategy, which conserved his car for the critical closing laps, made him one of the most formidable competitors at the 2.5-mile superspeedway. The Talladega races presented similar challenges and produced similar results. The massive Alabama superspeedway, the fastest track on the schedule, demanded the same combination of speed, strategy, and drafting expertise that Daytona required. Pearson's performances at Talladega were consistently strong, contributing to a superspeedway record that placed him among the most successful superspeedway racers in the sport's history. The physical endurance that Pearson maintained throughout his career was another factor in his success. The races of his era were long, often lasting 4 hours or more, and the cockpit conditions were brutal, with temperatures exceeding 130 degrees and no cooling systems to provide relief. Pearson's ability to maintain his concentration and his physical performance throughout these grueling events was a testament to his physical conditioning and his mental discipline. The late race surges that were his signature move required not just fresh tires and a conserved engine, but a fresh driver, a man whose physical and mental capabilities had not been diminished by the hours of heat and exertion that preceded the critical closing laps. The contrast between Pearson's public persona and his on-track presence was one of the most interesting paradoxes of his career. Off the track, Pearson was quiet, reserved, almost shy, a man who avoided the spotlight and who was uncomfortable in the role of public figure that his racing success had created. On the track, Pearson was a different person, confident, decisive, and capable of producing performances of stunning brilliance that seemed inconsistent with the modest, unassuming man who climbed from the car after the race was over. The paradox reveals something important about the nature of competitive excellence. The qualities that make a great competitor are not always the same qualities that make a great public figure. Pearson possessed the competitive qualities in abundance: the speed, the intelligence, the discipline, the courage. But he lacked the public qualities, the charisma, the media skill, the ease in front of the cameras, that translate competitive excellence into cultural celebrity. The result was a career that was, from a purely competitive standpoint, among the finest in the history of any sport, but that was, from a public recognition standpoint, less well known than those of contemporaries whose competitive achievements were comparable or inferior. The final races of Pearson's career were a poignant illustration of the inevitable decline that awaits every athlete, regardless of their talent or their determination. The speed that had once been the fastest in the field was no longer quite sufficient. The reflexes that had once been the sharpest were no longer quite as responsive. The strategic brilliance that had been his greatest asset was no longer sufficient to compensate for the physical limitations that age was imposing. Pearson competed with dignity and with effort, but the results of his final seasons were a reminder that even the greatest careers must eventually end. The technical evolution of the cars during Pearson's career created a constantly shifting, competitive environment that required continuous adaptation from the drivers and the teams. The cars that Pearson drove in the mid-1960s, when he won his first championship, were fundamentally different from the cars he drove during the Wood brothers' years in the 1970s. The engines were more powerful, the aerodynamics were more sophisticated, the suspension systems were more refined, the tires were more consistent. Every aspect of the racing machine evolved during the span of Pearson's career, and the ability to maintain competitive performance through these changes was a testament to his adaptability and his understanding of the fundamental principles of vehicle dynamics. The tire technology evolution was particularly significant. The tires available to Cup Series teams in the early years of Pearson's career were less sophisticated and less predictable than those available in later years. The development of purpose-built racing tires by manufacturers like Goodyear and Firestone improved the consistency and the performance of the tires, but also changed the competitive dynamics, rewarding teams and drivers who could understand and exploit the characteristics of the new tire compounds. Pearson's approach to tyre management was one of the most sophisticated aspects of his competitive strategy. He understood intuitively how the tyres degraded over the course of a run, how the handling characteristics of the car changed as the tyres wore, and how to adjust his driving style to compensate for the changing tyre conditions. The tyre management skills were a critical component of his late race strategy, ensuring that his car's tyres retained more performance potential in the closing laps than those of competitors who had pushed harder earlier in the race. The evolution of pit strategy during Pearson's career was another area where the competitive landscape was constantly changing. The number and the timing of pit stops, the amount of fuel taken during each stop, the decision about whether to change 2 tyres or 4, all of these variables required strategic calculations that could determine the outcome of a race. Pearson and the Wood brothers were among the most sophisticated strategic operators in the sport, and their ability to make the right pit strategy decisions was a significant competitive advantage. The role of the spotter, the team member stationed high above the track, whose job is to provide the driver with information about the positions and the movements of the other cars, was still developing during Pearson's era. In the early years, drivers relied primarily on their own observations, using their mirrors and their peripheral vision to track the positions of the cars around them. The limited information available to the driver made racing more dangerous and more demanding, requiring a level of spatial awareness and situational intelligence that modern drivers, who receive constant radio communication from their spotters, do not need to maintain to the same degree. Pearson's spatial awareness and his ability to track the movements of the cars around him while simultaneously managing the complex task of driving at high speed were among his most impressive cognitive abilities. The ability to maintain a comprehensive mental picture of the competitive situation, to know where every relevant car was on the track and what each driver was likely to do in the next few laps, was a critical component of the strategic approach that produced his victories. The influence of weather conditions on the racing during Pearson's era was more pronounced than it is in the modern sport. The tracks of the 1960s and 1970s were less consistently maintained than modern tracks, and changes in temperature, humidity, and wind conditions could significantly affect the handling characteristics of the cars and the grip level of the track surface. Pearson's sensitivity to these conditions, his ability to detect and respond to changes in the track surface that other drivers might not notice, was another competitive advantage that contributed to his extraordinary winning percentage. The mechanical reliability dimension of Pearson's success is sometimes overlooked, but was a significant factor in his career. The cars of his era were less mechanically reliable than modern race cars, with engine failures, transmission problems, and other mechanical issues ending races for even the best prepared teams. Pearson's smooth driving style, which placed less stress on the mechanical components of the car than the more aggressive styles of some of his competitors, contributed to the mechanical reliability of his cars and reduced the frequency of mechanical failures that could end a race prematurely. The connection between driving style and mechanical reliability was one of the subtle but important ways in which Pearson's intelligence translated into competitive advantage. By driving smoothly, by avoiding unnecessary stress on the engine, the transmission, and the suspension, Pearson reduced the probability of mechanical failure and increased the likelihood that his car would be running at the finish in position to execute the late race strategy that was his signature competitive weapon. The approach was intelligent, efficient, and devastatingly effective. The broadcast legacy of Pearson's most famous moments, particularly the 1976 Daytona 500 finish, has played an important role in preserving his reputation among modern fans who never had the opportunity to watch him race in real time. The footage of the last lap crash, with Pearson keeping his engine running while his car spins, and then limping across the finish line ahead of the stalled Petty, is one of the most frequently replayed clips in the history of the sport. The clip captures, in a few seconds of grainy footage, the essence of Pearson's competitive genius, the ability to think clearly in chaos, to plan ahead while events are still unfolding, and to find a way to win even when everything appears to have gone wrong. The moment has been analysed and discussed by racing commentators and historians for nearly 5 decades, and the consensus that has emerged from this analysis confirms what the racing community knew at the time. The presence of mind that Pearson demonstrated in keeping his foot on the clutch during the spin was not an accident. It was the product of a racing intelligence so deep and so instinctive that it operated even in the most extreme and most disorienting circumstances. While other drivers would have been focused on surviving the crash, Pearson was focused on winning the race. The distinction is the distinction between a very good driver and the greatest driver who ever lived. The seasonal rhythm of the Wood Brothers partnership created a competitive pattern that became one of the defining features of the Pearson legacy. The team would arrive at a race having prepared meticulously for the specific demands of the event, with the car optimized for the track's characteristics and the strategy developed to exploit the competitive dynamics of the particular race. Pearson would qualify near the front, demonstrating the raw speed that was one dimension of his ability. Then, during the race routes itself, he would execute the patient, calculated strategy that was the other dimension, producing a result that was, more often than not, a victory. The pattern was so consistent and so effective that it became, in the minds of the other competitors, a kind of inevitability. They knew that Pearson would be fast in qualifying. They knew that he would be conservative in the early stages of the race. They knew that he would begin to move forward as the race progressed. And they knew that in the closing laps, when their tyres were worn and their engines were tired, Pearson would be there, his car fresh and fast and positioned to strike. The knowledge did not make the strategy easier to counter. If anything, the knowledge made it harder, because the anticipation of Pearson's late race charge created a psychological pressure that affected the decision-making of every driver in the field. The 105th and final Cup Series victory of David Pearson's career came in 1980, at the age of 45, a testament to the durability and the competitive longevity that his partial schedule approach had preserved. The final victory was not a spectacular, headline-grabbing triumph. It was a workmanlike performance, the kind of solid, professional result that had characterized so much of Pearson's career, a victory earned through the application of skill and intelligence rather than through dramatic flair or aggressive driving. The quietness of the final victory was, in its own way, a fitting conclusion to a career that had been defined by its efficiency and its lack of ostentation. Pearson did not need a dramatic farewell to validate his career. The record spoke for itself: 105 victories, 3 championships, 113 poles, and a winning percentage that no one had matched and that no one is likely to match. The final victory was simply the last entry in a ledger of excellence that had been accumulating for more than 2 decades. The post-career life that Pearson built in South Carolina was consistent with the values that had defined his competitive years. He returned to the community that had raised him, maintaining his connection to the people and the place that had shaped his character. He was available to fans and to the racing community, attending events and making appearances when his health permitted, but he did not seek the spotlight or the attention that some retired champions pursue. The retirement was quiet, private, and dignified, consistent with the character of a man who had always believed that his driving should speak louder than his words. The racing community's treatment of Pearson during his retirement years was a reflection of the respect that his career had earned. He was honoured at events and ceremonies, recognized as one of the founding members of the NASCAR Hall of Fame, and acknowledged by drivers and team owners of every generation as one of the greatest who had ever competed. The honours were deserved and were received with the quiet gratitude that characterized Pearson's response to every recognition he received throughout his life. The decline in Pearson's health during his later years was a poignant coda to a remarkable life. The physical toll of decades of stock car racing, combined with the natural effects of aging, diminished his public presence and limited his ability to participate in the events and the activities that the racing community organized to honor its legends. The decline was handled with the dignity and the privacy that Pearson had always valued, and the racing community respected his wishes honoring his legacy through their words and their memories, rather than through demands for his public presence. The November 2018 passing of David Pearson at the age of 83 was a loss that the racing community felt deeply. The tributes that followed his death came from every corner of the sport, from active drivers and retired champions, from team owners and mechanics, from media members and fans who understood the magnitude of the career that had ended. The tributes acknowledged the victories and the championships, but they also acknowledged the character of the man, the modesty, the intelligence, the quiet determination, and the absolute refusal to compromise his values in pursuit of fame or recognition. Richard Petty's tribute to his great rival was particularly moving. The King, who had competed against Pearson more frequently and more intensely than anyone else, spoke of his rival with a respect and an affection that transcended the competitive tensions of their racing days. Petty's words confirmed what the racing community had always known, that the rivalry between the two men had been conducted in a spirit of mutual respect that enriched both competitors and elevated the sport as a whole. The competitive legacy of the Petty-Pearson rivalry extends into the modern era through the influence it has had on the way the sport understands and celebrates its competitive narratives. The rivalry established the template for the great rivalries that would follow: Earnhardt versus Gordon, Gordon versus Johnson, the various competitive battles that have defined subsequent eras. Each of these later rivalries owed something to the Petty-Pearson precedent, the precedent of two great champions pushing each other to ever higher levels of performance through the intensity and the consistency of their competition. The 63-1-2 finishes between the two men remain the most remarkable statistical artifact of their rivalry, a number that captures the frequency and the closeness of their competition in a way that no other statistic can match. 63 times, the two greatest drivers of their era finished first and second, separated at the finish by margins that were often measured in fractions of a second. The number speaks to the quality of the competition and to the mutual respect that sustained it, a respect that allowed the two men to race hard against each other without the rancor and the hostility that have characterized some of the sport's other great rivalries. The race-by-race records from the Petty-Pearson years reveal a competitive dynamic that was remarkably balanced. In any given race, either man was capable of winning, and the outcome was often determined by the specific circumstances of that particular event: the track, the weather, the condition of the cars, the strategic decisions that each driver and his team made during the course of the race. The balance of the competition was part of what made it so compelling, the knowledge that the outcome was never predetermined and that the winner would be the driver who executed most effectively on that particular day. The deeper truth about David Pearson is that he was the best driver who ever sat behind the wheel of a stock car, and the sport has never fully come to terms with that fact. The statement is not made casually. It is the product of careful examination of the statistical record, the testimony of the men who competed against him, and the analysis of the racing experts who have studied the sport's history with the rigor that the subject deserves. When you adjust for schedule, when you account for the fact that Pearson voluntarily limited his racing to a partial schedule during the most productive years of his career, the statistical case for Pearson as the greatest of all time is overwhelming. Let that sink in. David Pearson won 105 Cup Series races in 674 career starts. That is a winning percentage of approximately 15.6%. Richard Petty, the all-time wins leader, won 200 races in 1,184 starts, a winning percentage of approximately 16.9%. The percentages are comparable, but the context is different. Petty ran a full schedule throughout his career, entering every race on the calendar. Pearson, during the Wood Brothers years, entered only the most competitive races, the events that attracted the strongest fields and the most intense competition. The winning percentage that Pearson maintained while competing selectively in the toughest races on the calendar is arguably more impressive than the percentage Petty maintained while competing in every event, including races with weaker fields. During the Wood Brothers years specifically, The winning percentage was more than 30%, a figure that has no parallel in the history of the sport. No other driver, in any era, has sustained a winning percentage of that magnitude over a comparable number of starts. The statistic is so extraordinary that it almost requires suspension of disbelief, but it is real, documented in the official records of the sport, and verified by the memories of the men who witnessed it. The testimony of Pearson's peers is the other pillar of the case for his supremacy. Richard Petty, who competed against Pearson more frequently and more intensely than anyone else, has said repeatedly that Pearson was the best driver he ever raced against. The statement carries enormous weight, coming as it does from a man who won 200 races and 7 championships, and who competed against virtually every significant driver of his era. When the king says that someone else was better, the judgment demands attention. It's Bobby Allison, whose own career produced 84 victories and a championship, echoed Petty's assessment. Allison, who was known for his honest and sometimes blunt evaluations of other drivers, said that Pearson was the most complete and the most talented driver he had ever seen. The completeness was the key word. Allison's acknowledgement that Pearson possessed not just speed or strategy, but the full range of competitive abilities. The ability to qualify fast, to manage a race, to conserve his equipment, and to produce breathtaking speed when the moment demanded it. Cale Yarborough, whose 3 consecutive championships and 83 victories established his own claim to all-time greatness, recognized Pearson as a uniquely difficult competitor. Yarborough, whose aggressive driving style was the antithesis of Pearson's smooth, calculating approach, acknowledged that racing against the Silver Fox required a level of strategic awareness that no other competitor demanded. Pearson was not just fast, he was smart, and the combination of speed and intelligence made him more dangerous than any driver who possessed only one of the 2 qualities. These assessments, offered independently by 3 of the greatest drivers in the sport's history, constitute a verdict that no statistical analysis could improve upon. The men who knew David Pearson's speed from the inside of a cockpit, who felt the pressure of his presence in their mirrors, and who experienced the frustration of watching him execute his late-race strategies to perfection, are unanimous in their judgment. He was the best. Let that sink in. The best. Not the most famous, not the most statistically prolific, not the most commercially successful, or the most publicly visible. The best. The man whose combination of natural talent, racing intelligence, and competitive discipline was, in the estimation of those most qualified to judge, without equal in the history of the sport. The quiet nature of Pearson's personality is perhaps the most important factor in understanding why this verdict has not been more widely recognized. Pearson was not a man who sought attention. He was not comfortable in the spotlight, not skilled at the self-promotion that converts athletic achievement into cultural celebrity. He raced. He won. He went home. The simplicity of this approach was admirable, but it was also, from the perspective of historical reputation, costly. In a world that rewards visibility and penalizes modesty, Pearson's reticence allowed his achievements to be obscured by the louder, more visible careers of his contemporaries. The contrast with Petty is instructive. Petty was a master of public relations, a man who understood intuitively that a champion's legacy is built not just on the track, but in the media and in the public imagination. Petty wore his iconic cowboy hat and sunglasses. He signed every autograph. He posed for every photograph. He gave every interview. He cultivated a public persona that was warm, accessible, and endlessly charming. And the persona became inseparable from the achievements, creating a cultural footprint that dwarfed those of drivers whose on-track accomplishments were comparable to or greater than his own. Pearson did none of this. He did not have a signature look. He did not cultivate media relationships. He did not seek to build a brand or to create a public persona that would extend his influence beyond the racetrack. He was, in the parlance of the modern media landscape, terrible at marketing himself. And the cost of this failure, if failure it was, is that his legacy has been consistently undervalued by a culture that measures greatness partly through the lens of visibility and celebrity. The health challenges that marked Pearson's later years added a dimension of poignancy to a legacy that was already shadowed by underappreciation. As he aged, Pearson's public appearances became less frequent, and the opportunities for the sport and its fans to honor his contributions became more limited. The passage of time, which should have enhanced his reputation as the full scope of his achievements became clearer, instead worked against him, as the fans who had witnessed his dominance grew older and the younger generations, raised on the exploits of later champions, had limited exposure to the Pearson story. The passing of David Pearson on November the 12th, 2018, at the age of 83, brought a wave of tributes from across the racing world that acknowledged, belatedly but sincerely, the magnitude of what he had accomplished. The tributes came from drivers, team owners, media members, and fans who understood that the sport had lost one of its most important and most talented figures. The tributes acknowledged the victories and the championships, but they also acknowledged the quieter dimensions of Pearson's character, the modesty, the humility, and the genuine love of racing that had animated his entire career. The deeper truth about David Pearson's career is that it challenges our assumptions about what greatness looks like. We expect greatness to be loud, visible, and self-assured. We expect great champions to proclaim their own excellence and to seek the recognition that their achievements deserve. Pearson did none of these things. His greatness was quiet, expressed through the language of lap times and finishing positions, rather than the language of media appearances and public statements. The silence was a choice, consistent with the character of a man who had grown up in a mill village and who had never forgotten where he came from or lost the modesty that his origins had instilled in him. The mill village boy who became the Silver Fox carried the values of Whitney, South Carolina, with him throughout his career. The humility, the work ethic, the quiet confidence that comes from knowing what you can do without needing to tell the world about it. These values made him a great driver. They also made him an underappreciated one. The trade-off was one that Pearson accepted without complaint, because the alternative, the self-promotion, and the media cultivation that might have enhanced his public reputation, was inconsistent with who he was. Pearson would rather be great than be famous, and the choice, while costly in terms of historical recognition, was entirely consistent with the character of a man for whom authenticity was more important than image. The concept of racing intelligence that Pearson embodied deserves particular examination because it represents a dimension of competitive excellence that is often overlooked in favor of the more visceral qualities of speed and aggression. Racing intelligence is the ability to process information during a race, to understand the strategic implications of changing conditions, to anticipate the decisions of competitors, and to make choices that optimize the probability of a favorable outcome. It is, in essence, the capacity to think clearly and strategically while operating a machine at the limits of its capabilities in conditions of extreme stress and danger. Pearson's racing intelligence was, by universal acclaim, the highest the sport has ever seen. He processed information faster than other drivers. He anticipated developments before they occurred. He understood the implications of tire wear, fuel consumption, track conditions, and competitive dynamics with a depth that allowed him to make strategic choices that seemed, in retrospect, almost prescient. The late race surges that were his signature move were not lucky. They were the product of a mind that had been calculating, throughout the race, the optimal moment to unleash his full capabilities, and that consistently identified that moment with an accuracy that bordered on the supernatural. The racing intelligence was complemented by a physical sensitivity to the car that was equally extraordinary. Pearson could feel things through the steering wheel and through the seat of his pants that other drivers could not. He could sense minute changes in the car's handling that signaled developing problems, changes so subtle that the data acquisition systems of the modern era would struggle to detect them. The sensitivity allowed him to adjust his driving in real time, compensating for changing conditions and maintaining the car's performance at a level that reflected his complete understanding of the machine's behavior. The combination of racing intelligence and physical sensitivity produced a driver who was, in every measurable dimension, the most complete competitor the sport has ever seen. He could qualify fast. He could manage a race. He could conserve his tyres. He could produce devastating speed in the closing laps. He could win on superspeedways, on short tracks, on road courses, on intermediate ovals. He could win from the front and from the back of the field. He could win with the best car and with a car that was not the best. The completeness of his ability was the thing that set him apart from every other driver, including those whose raw speed or aggressive driving style might have been, in isolation, more impressive. What does David Pearson's legacy mean to the sport of NASCAR today? The question is complicated by the underappreciation that has followed Pearson throughout his career and into the years since his death. The legacy is immense by any objective measure, but it has not been recognized with the consistency and the visibility that it deserves. The 105 victories, the 3 championships, the 113 pole positions, the extraordinary winning percentage during the Wood brothers' years, all of these achievements place Pearson among the 2 or 3 greatest drivers in the history of the sport. But the public recognition of this greatness has lagged behind the private recognition, the recognition that exists within the racing community, but that has not fully penetrated the broader culture. The legacy is, in part, a lesson about the relationship between achievement and recognition. Pearson's career demonstrates that the two are not always proportional, that it is possible to be among the greatest in the history of a sport, and yet to be less well known than contemporaries whose achievements were comparable but whose public visibility was greater. The lesson is not a comfortable one, because it suggests that the criteria by which we evaluate greatness are influenced by factors, media presence, self-promotion, public personality, that are unrelated to the competitive achievements themselves. The Petty-Pearson rivalry, which was the defining competitive relationship of their era, produced a body of racing that deserves to be remembered as one of the great rivalries in the history of American sport. 63 races in which they finished first and second, 33 victories for Pearson, 30 for Petty, thousands of laps run side by side at speeds that demanded absolute concentration and absolute trust in one's own abilities. The rivalry pushed both to levels of performance that they might not have achieved without the other's challenge, and the sport was the beneficiary of a competitive dynamic that elevated every race in which they both competed. The Wood brothers' partnership is another dimension of the legacy that deserves preservation. The collaboration between Pearson and the Wood brothers racing team produced one of the most efficient and most successful partnerships in the history of motorsport. The winning percentage they achieved together, more than 30% over a 7-year period, is a record that is unlikely ever to be broken, because the conditions that produced it, a driver of transcendent talent paired with a team of exceptional competence running a selective schedule against the strongest competition in the sport, are unlikely to be replicated. The influence of Pearson's driving style on subsequent generations of drivers is another legacy that persists, even if it is not always explicitly acknowledged. The emphasis on tyre conservation, on strategic patience, on the calculated deployment of speed at the optimal moments of a race, all of these elements of Pearson's approach have been adopted by champions in every era of the sport. Jimmy Johnson's methodical, consistent approach to championship racing owed a debt to the template that Pearson had established decades earlier. Jeff Gordon's ability to manage races and to produce late-race speed when it mattered most reflected the same principles that Pearson had perfected during the Wood brothers' years. The philosophical dimension of Pearson's legacy speaks to the nature of competitive excellence itself. In a sport that has traditionally valued aggression and physical courage above strategic intelligence, Pearson demonstrated that the smartest driver can also be the most successful. His career was a refutation of the assumption that racing is purely a physical pursuit, a contest of reflexes and nerve, and the willingness to take risks. Pearson showed that racing is also an intellectual pursuit, a contest of strategic thinking and situational awareness, and the ability to process complex information in real time under conditions of extreme stress. The influence extends beyond the specific techniques and strategies that Pearson employed. It extends to the broader principle that excellence in any field is the product not just of talent but of intelligence, not just of effort but of strategy, not just of courage but of wisdom. Pearson's career is an illustration of this principle, a demonstration that the most effective competitor is not always the one who pushes the hardest, but the one who pushes the smartest. The community of Whitney, South Carolina, the mill village where Pearson grew up and where the values that shaped his character were formed, is itself a legacy. The village is a reminder that greatness can emerge from the most humble circumstances, that the accident of birth does not determine the trajectory of a life, and that the qualities that produce champions, intelligence, discipline, patience, and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing what you can do are not the exclusive property of the privileged, but are available to anyone who possesses them, regardless of their social or economic origins. Pearson never forgot Whitney. He never forgot the mill and the modest house and the limited horizons that had defined his early life. The memory of where he came from was not a burden. It was a foundation, a source of strength and perspective that grounded him throughout a career that took him to heights that no one in Whitney could have imagined. The connection between the mill village and the victory lane, between the cotton spinning machines and the checkered flags, is the most human and the most inspiring thread in the Pearson story. A reminder that the distance between where you start and where you finish is determined not by the starting point, but by the person making the journey. In the end, the story of David Pearson is a story about the difference between fame and greatness. Fame is loud, fame is visible. Fame is the cowboy hat and the sunglasses and the million autographs signed on the backs of programs and the brims of caps. Fame is the face on the billboard and the name in the headline and the voice on the television interview. Fame is the thing that the world gives to those who seek its attention, and it is a powerful force, capable of shaping reputations and influencing the judgments of history in ways that have nothing to do with the actual achievements of the people it touches. Greatness is quieter. Greatness does not require an audience. Greatness does not need to be announced or promoted or defended. Greatness simply is. It exists in the record, in the statistics, in the memories of the people who witnessed it, and in the enduring respect of the peers who competed against it and who know, from the inside rather than the outside, what it looked like and what it cost. David Pearson was great. 105 victories, 3 championships, 113 pole positions, a winning percentage during the Wood brothers' years that has never been equaled, and that is unlikely ever to be approached. A driving style that combined raw speed with strategic brilliance in a combination that his peers, unanimously and without reservation, considered the finest the sport has ever produced. The fame did not match the greatness. It never does for people like David Pearson, people who are more interested in the work than in the recognition, who would rather win a race than win a popularity contest, who measure their lives not by the attention they receive, but by the excellence they produce. The disparity between fame and greatness is the central irony of Pearson's legacy, the thing that gives his story its particular poignancy and its particular power. The question posed by this documentary, whether David Pearson was the greatest driver who ever lived, has a clear answer. He was. Not in the sense that his victory total was the highest, because it was not. Not in the sense that his championship total was the most impressive, because others have won more. But in the sense that his combination of natural talent, racing intelligence, competitive efficiency, and the unanimous verdict of his peers places him at the very top of any honest, informed assessment of the sport's all-time hierarchy. Richard Petty won more races. Dale Earnhardt won more championships. Jeff Gordon competed in a more visible era. Jimmy Johnson sustained his excellence over more consecutive seasons. But none of them, not one, was considered by his peers to be a better, more complete, more talented driver than David Pearson. And the judgment of peers, the verdict of the men who shared the track and the danger and the speed, is the only judgment that ultimately matters. The son of a mill worker from Whitney, South Carolina, the Silver Fox, the man who won 105 races and 3 championships and 113 pole positions while running a partial schedule for most of his prime years. The man who kept his foot on the clutch while his car was spinning at Daytona, who limped across the finish line in a battered Mercury to win the most famous race in the sport, who did more with less than any driver who ever lived. They called him the Silver Fox, and the name, which described his cunning and his patience and his calculating brilliance behind the wheel, was the most accurate nickname in the history of the sport. He was silver, quiet and elegant, and valuable beyond what the surface suggested. And he was a fox, sharp and clever and always, always one step ahead. The engines are quiet now. The tracks where Pearson raced have been resurfaced and reconfigured, the turns rebanked and the walls rebuilt. The cars are different, the drivers are different. The sport has moved on, as it always does, producing new champions and new stories and new rivalries that capture the attention of the present and push the past further into the background. But the record remains. 105 victories, 3 championships, 113 poles, a winning percentage that no one has matched, and the quiet, enduring judgment of every man who ever raced against him, that David Pearson was the best who ever sat behind the wheel of a stock car. That is not fame. That is something better. That is the truth.